February 18th, 1878. The air in the canyon was thin and cold, carrying the metallic scent of snow that had not yet fallen but hung heavy in the gray clouds above the Capitan Mountains. On the ground, the frozen mud of the trail held the deep, chaotic impressions of horse hooves where a frantic scramble had just occurred. John Tunstall lay face up on the hard earth, his body cooling rapidly in the winter chill. A singular dark hole marred his chest, and a second, more devastating wound had shattered the back of his head, ending the life of the English rancher and igniting a fuse that would burn through the entire territory. The men who had killed him, a sub-posse of the sheriff's chosen enforcers, had already ridden off, their laughter and the thud of their mounts fading into the silence of the evergreen forest. They left behind not just a corpse, but a declaration of war written in blood against the frozen soil. The brutality of the act was absolute. There was no attempt to arrest, no parley, only the sudden, violent erasure of a man who had dared to challenge the economic monopoly of the Santa Fe ring. News of the murder traveled with the speed of a desperate rider pushing a horse to its limit. When the word reached the town of Lincoln, the reaction was not mourning, but a sharp, crystalline crystallization of rage. Alexander McSween, Tunstall's lawyer and partner, received the news with a pale, trembling fury, knowing that the law in Lincoln County was now merely a weapon held by those who had ordered the killing. The town itself, a collection of adobe structures strung along the Rio Bonito, seemed to hold its breath. The usual noise of the street, the rattle of wagons and the shout of merchants dampened into hushed whispers and fearful glances toward the horizon. The lines were no longer being drawn. They had been cut deep into the earth. Dick Brewer, a man of intense discipline and simmering anger, viewed the body of his employer with a gaze that promised retribution. He did not weep. Instead, he turned his attention to the mechanics of justice in a land where the sheriff was the enemy. Brewer knew that to fight a badge, he needed a badge, or at least a piece of paper that resembled one. He moved through the town with a stiff, determined gait, gathering the men who had worked for Tunstall, men who were now unemployed and dangerously adrift. These were not soldiers, but ranch hands, drifters, and young men with a surplus of pride and a deficit of fear. Among them stood a slight, buck-toothed youth named William Bonney, whose eyes held a vacuous, terrifying focus as he cleaned the mud from his fingernails. The funeral service was a grim affair, devoid of the usual frontier platitudes. The wooden coffin was lowered into the ground behind the McSween store, the soil thumping hollowly against the lid. Every shovel of dirt thrown into the grave seemed to seal the resolve of the men standing around it. They did not disperse after the final prayer. Instead, they congregated in the shadows of the McSween home, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of wet wool drying by the hearth. They spoke in low tones, listing the names of the men they knew had pulled the triggers: Jesse Evans, Frank Baker, Tom Hill, and William Morton. The list was recited like a catechism, burned into their memories. They knew these men, had drank with some of them, and now they intended to kill them. Brewer sought out John Wilson, the local justice of the peace. Wilson was a man caught in the middle, a minor official in a county dominated by major violence. Brewer demanded warrants for the arrest of Tunstall's killers. It was a legal maneuver, a thin veneer of legitimacy draped over a core of vengeance. Wilson, looking at the hard faces of the men standing behind Brewer, signed the papers. He appointed Dick Brewer as a special constable, granting him the authority to raise a posse to serve the warrants. It was the permission they needed. They were no longer a lynch mob, they were the Regulators. The name itself implied a correction, a mechanical fix to a broken system. The preparation for the manhunt began immediately and was conducted with military precision. The men gathered their gear, checking every strap of leather and every buckle for weakness. A broken cinch or a snapped rein could mean death in the rough country they were about to traverse. They checked the hooves of their horses, digging out impacted stones and checking the shoes for tightness. The animals sensed the tension, shifting their weight and tossing their heads, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Saddles were hefted onto backs, the leather groaning as cinches were pulled tight against winter coats. Bedrolls were tied down, containing meager rations of flour, coffee, and bacon. They were packing for a long haul, expecting to sleep on the hard ground and eat cold food until the job was done. The weaponry was the primary focus. This was 1878, and the tools of the trade were evolving. The men carried Winchester Model 1873 rifles, the gun that won the West. These lever-action repeaters were capable of unleashing a rapid stream of .44-40 caliber slugs. They were tools of suppression and volume, allowing a rider to pour fire into a target without taking his eyes off the sights. The men sat on crates and benches, disassembling the actions, wiping away grit and old grease and applying fresh oil. They worked the levers, listening to the smooth clack-clack of the brass carrier blocks rising and falling. They loaded the tubular magazines, sliding the round-nosed cartridges in one by one until the springs were fully compressed. Revolvers, mostly Colts in .45 caliber, were checked for timing and cylinder gap. Holsters were positioned for an easy draw, tied down to thighs to prevent the leather from flapping during a gallop. The posse that formed under Brewer was a mix of personalities united by a single purpose. There was Frank McNabb, a former cattle detective with a sharp mind and a sharper eye. There was Doc Scurlock, a man who had reportedly studied medicine before turning to the gun, his intelligence making him dangerous in a way that brute force could not match. There were the co-cousins, Frank and George, men of the soil who had been pushed too far. And there was Charlie Boder, a man who possessed a cheerful demeanor that masked a deadly competence with a firearm. They stood in a loose semicircle, their breath mingling in the cold air as Brewer addressed them. He held the warrants in his hand, waving the papers as if they were holy scripture. He told them that they were the law now. He told them that the sheriff, William Brady, had forfeited his right to enforce the peace by sanctioning the murder of an innocent man. The objective was clear: find the men named in the warrants. But the list in their minds was longer than the list on the paper. It included anyone who had ridden with the killers, anyone who had supported the house, the powerful mercantile monopoly that Tunstall had opposed. The distinction between the actual shooters and their associates began to blur. In the eyes of the Regulators, guilt was contagious. If a man rode with wolves, he would be treated as a wolf. This widened the scope of their operation significantly. They were not just hunting 4 men, they were hunting a faction. On the morning of their departure, the sky was a bruised purple, the sun struggling to break through the overcast layer. The town of Lincoln watched them ride out, a column of heavily armed men moving with a singular predatory intent. The sound of 19 horses walking in unison created a low, rhythmic rumble that vibrated through the adobe walls. They headed toward the mountains, following the tracks and the rumors that pointed toward the hideouts of the boys, the loose gang of rustlers and gunmen employed by the house. The landscape they entered was unforgiving. The high desert was a tapestry of scrub brush, pinon pine, and jagged rock, broken by arroyos that could hide a regiment. The wind cut through their coats, stinging their faces and numbing their fingers. But they pressed on, fueled by the heat of their mission. They rode for days, sweeping through the remote ranches and line shacks scattered across the county. At each stop, they interrogated the inhabitants, their hands resting near their holsters. They kicked open doors and overturned crates, searching for signs of their quarry. They were thorough, driven by a paranoia that every shadow held an ambush. The exhaustion began to set in, the physical toll of long hours in the saddle grinding down their patience. They slept in shifts, huddled around small, smokeless fires in the bottom of ravines, eating hardtack and drinking bitter coffee that tasted of tin and river water. The conversation around these fires was sparse. They spoke of trajectories, of cover, of the best way to approach a blind canyon. They were becoming a single organism, a pack hunting its prey. The intelligence they gathered pointed them toward the Penasco River. Rumors placed the killers Morton and Baker in that vicinity, trying to lay low until the heat died down, leading to a running gun battle that spanned miles. The Regulators pushed their horses harder, sensing that the gap was closing. The terrain became rougher, the trails narrowing as they wound through the rocky hills. The horses stumbled on the loose shale, their sides heaving with exertion. The men ignored the fatigue, their eyes scanning the ridgelines for the silhouette of a rider or the glint of sun on metal. They knew that their enemies were also heavily armed and likely expecting them. This was not a police action. It was a movement to contact. During this initial sweep, the name Andrew Roberts was not the primary focus, yet it floated in the periphery of their intelligence. Roberts, known as Buckshot due to the load of shot he carried in his right shoulder from a past conflict, was an associate of the boys. He had ridden with the posse that killed Tunstall, though his direct involvement in the shooting was a matter of debate. To the Regulators, however, the nuance was irrelevant. Roberts was a part of the machinery that had crushed Tunstall. He was a friend to their enemies, and in the binary world of the Lincoln County War, that made him a target. They heard whispers that Roberts was looking to sell out and leave, to cash in his chips and vanish. To Brewer and his men, this sounded like a flight from justice. The weather turned worse as the days progressed. A sleet storm hammered the posse, coating their slickers in a layer of ice. The water froze in their canteens and their fingers became so stiff that working a trigger guard would have been difficult. Yet the adversity seemed to harden their resolve. They viewed the suffering as a tithe paid toward the vengeance they sought. Every shivering hour in the saddle justified the violence they intended to inflict. They were earning their kills. The isolation of the wilderness stripped away the constraints of civilization. Out here, there were no judges, no juries, no appeals. There was only the tracker and the tracked. As they closed in on the location where Morton and Baker were rumored to be, the group split and reformed, checking flanked positions. They utilized the terrain, moving along the draws to stay off the skyline. They were learning the art of guerrilla warfare on the fly, adapting to the landscape. Brewer kept a tight rein on the younger men, particularly Bonnie, who seemed to vibrate with a restless energy. Brewer needed the kill to be clean, or at least covered by the paper he carried in his pocket. He needed to maintain the illusion that this was a lawful arrest, even if everyone involved knew the likely outcome. The first major success of their campaign came not with a bang, but with a surrender. They cornered Morton and Baker near the Penasco. After a tense standoff where rifles were leveled and threats exchanged across the open ground, the two fugitives surrendered, perhaps believing that the presence of a calm man like McCluskey, a regulator who had vouched for their safety, would ensure they made it back to Lincoln alive. The prisoners were disarmed, their weapons added to the Regulators' arsenal. They were placed on horses, their hands bound, and the procession turned back toward Lincoln. The journey back was tense. Morton and Baker rode in the center of the column, surrounded by men who looked at them with undisguised hatred. The prisoners knew their lives hung by a thread. They tried to make conversation, to humanize themselves to their captors, but their words fell on deaf ears. The Regulators were not interested in excuses. They were remembering the sight of Tunstall's body in the snow. On the 9th of March, at a place called Blackwater Creek, the pretense of the law evaporated. The details of what happened would always remain murky, obscured by the self-serving testimonies of the survivors. What was certain was that William McCluskey, the man who had promised to protect the prisoners, was shot dead first. His body hit the ground, removing the moral obstacle. Moments later, Morton and Baker were riddled with bullets. The official story concocted by the Regulators was that Morton had snatched McCloskey's pistol, killed him, and then tried to escape with Baker, forcing the posse to fire. It was a flimsy lie, transparent to anyone who heard it, but it served its purpose. The warrants had been served. The execution had been carried out. The killing of Morton and Baker, along with their own man McCloskey, crossed a threshold for the Regulators. They had blood on their hands now, not just the blood of enemies, but the blood of a moderate who had stood in the way of their rage. This act bound them together in a pact of shared guilt. There was no turning back. They were now outlaws in the eyes of the sheriff and the governor, regardless of the warrants Brewer carried. The stakes had been raised to the maximum. If they were caught, they would hang. The only way forward was to finish the list. They returned to the area around Lincoln, not as conquering heroes, but as a grim Reaper squad. They resupplied, taking fresh horses and ammunition. The town was more divided than ever. The Santa Fe Ring and the House faction were mobilizing their own forces, hiring gunmen from as far away as Texas. The war was escalating. The Regulators knew they had to strike fast before the weight of the territorial government crushed them. They looked at their list again. Names had been crossed off, but many remained. The focus shifted. They needed to sweep the remaining pockets of resistance. They received word that other members of the posse that killed Tunstall were scattering, trying to dissolve into the landscape. One of those men was Buckshot Roberts. The intelligence they received suggested he was in the area of Blazer's Mill, a sawmill and trading post on the Tularosa River. It was a critical gathering point, a place where a man could get a meal, trade mules, and hear the news. It was a natural choke point. Brewer gathered his men. The squad had fluctuated in size, men coming and going, but the core remained. 13 men prepared to ride out again. They were harder now, weathered by the weeks of hunting and the act of killing. Their eyes were sunk deep in their sockets, surrounded by the grime of the trail. Their clothes were stained with mud and grease. They checked their Winchesters again, a ritual that had become as automatic as breathing. The magazine springs were tight, the actions oiled. They loaded their saddlebags with fresh rounds. The ride toward the Tularosa was planned with the intent of interception. They were not just going to check the mill, they were going to occupy it. They would turn the trading post into a net and wait for the fish to swim in. The confidence of the group was high. They had numbers. 13 guns against whatever stragglers they might find. They had the element of surprise, and they had the momentum of violence on their side. As they rode out of Lincoln, the sun was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting a flat gray light over the valley. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass and rattling the bare branches of the cottonwoods. The 13 men rode in a loose formation, their eyes scanning the horizon. They were the hunters, the apex predators of the county. They did not know that they were riding toward a confrontation that would test their resolve against a single man who had been sculpted by war and pain. They did not know that the list in their pockets was about to lead them into a buzzsaw. They only knew that there were debts to be paid, and they were the collectors. The hooves of their horses struck the earth with a steady drumming rhythm, marking the seconds ticking down to a collision that would become legend. The warrant was their shield, the Winchester was their sword, and the list was their map. They rode west toward the mountains and the mill into the teeth of history. March 25, 1878. The wind sweeping down from the Sierra Blanca peaks carried a biting frost that ignored the calendar's claim of spring. On a small patch of land along the Ruidoso River, Andrew L. Roberts stood amidst the remnants of his life as a rancher, watching his breath vanish into the cold morning air. He was a man physically shaped by violence, his body a map of old conflicts that had never fully healed. He was small in stature, a fact that often caused strangers to underestimate him until they saw the stillness in his eyes. His right shoulder hung with a stiffness that ruined the symmetry of his frame, the joint ruined years prior by a load of buckshot that had torn through muscle and bone. The projectiles remained embedded deep within him, grinding against the joint with every movement, a permanent internal reminder of the cost of living by the gun. This injury had stripped him of the ability to raise a rifle to his shoulder in the conventional manner, forcing him to adapt, to learn to shoot from the hip or to cradle the weapon across his body, compensating for the mechanical failure of his arm with a terrifying, unnatural precision. Roberts was done. The escalation of hostilities in Lincoln County had transformed the territory from a hard land into a slaughterhouse, and he had no desire to be processed through its machinery. He had seen enough war in his lifetime, having served in the Union Army, or the Confederate, depending on which rumor one believed, though his discipline suggested a formal military background, and he recognized the signs of a losing battle. The killing of Tunstall and the subsequent rise of the Regulators had removed the boundaries of civilized conflict. It was no longer about property or cattle, it was about extermination. Roberts knew his name was associated with the Murphy-Dolan faction, the House, simply because he had ridden with the posse to serve the attachment on Tunstall's cattle. He had been there when the Englishman died, but he maintained he had not pulled the trigger. In the current climate, however, such distinctions were meaningless. Guilt was determined by association, and the penalty was death. He spent the morning finalizing the liquidation of his assets. He had found a buyer for his claim, a man willing to take on the land and the trouble that came with it. The transaction was conducted with the curt efficiency of a man in a hurry. There was no haggling over the price of fence lines or the quality of the water rights. Roberts took what he could get, focused entirely on the conversion of immobile property into portable currency. He sold his few head of cattle, the animals milling about in the pen, their breath steaming as they were tallied and transferred. He watched them go without sentiment. They were just weight and value now converted into paper and coin that he could carry in his saddlebags. Packing his belongings was a process of ruthless elimination. He could only take what his mule could carry and what he could defend. He laid out his gear on the rough planks of his cabin floor. A bedroll, thick enough to ward off the high-altitude chill but tight enough to strap behind a saddle. A sack of coffee beans, a slab of cured bacon, a tin of flour. These were the fuels of travel. He checked his ammunition supply with obsessive care. He carried a box of 44-40 cartridges for his rifle and 45 caliber rounds for his pistol. He wiped each cartridge with a dry rag, inspecting the primers and the crimp of the brass. A jammed casing or a dud primer was not a mechanical inconvenience. It was a death sentence. He placed the heavy boxes into his saddlebags, distributing the weight evenly to ensure the mule would travel without a list. His choice of mount was pragmatic. He did not ride a high-spirited stallion or a gelding bred for speed. He rode a mule. It was a sturdy, sure-footed beast smaller than a horse but possessed of an endurance and intelligence that suited the terrain. The mule would not panic in gunfire. It would not stumble on the loose shale of the mountain trails. For a man with a crippled arm, the mule offered a stable platform. Roberts approached the animal, running his hand along its flank, checking the cinch. He tightened the girth, the leather creaking as he pulled it snug. He checked the bridle, ensuring the bit was seated correctly. The mule stood patient, its long ears twitching at the sound of the wind. The weapon Roberts relied on was a Winchester Model 1873 carbine. It was a utilitarian tool, the bluing worn from friction against saddle leather and clothing. He cycled the action, the lever moving with a metallic fluidity that spoke of constant maintenance. He did not look at the rifle as an object of affection, but as an extension of his will. Because of his shoulder, he had modified his relationship with the gun. He did not tuck the stock into the pocket of his shoulder. Instead, he held it lower, using his left hand to support the weight and his right to work the trigger and lever, firing from a crouch or a brace. He had practiced this until the sight picture was automatic, the bullet striking true despite the unorthodox stance. He slid the carbine into the scabbard, the familiar weight settling against the mule's flank. Roberts left his cabin shortly after noon. He did not look back. The structure of logs and mud was no longer his home. It was just a landmark on a map he intended to leave behind. He turned the mule west toward the mountains. His destination was not immediately out of the territory, but rather a specific waypoint. Blazer's Mill. The mill served as the post office for the region, and Roberts was expecting a check, the final payment for a portion of his property. He could not leave without it. The money represented his future, his stake for a new start in Arizona or Mexico, anywhere the Lincoln County War could not reach him. The irony of riding toward the very center of the community to escape it was not lost on him, but the logistics demanded it. The journey was slow. The snow in the higher elevations was melting, turning the trails into quagmires of slick mud and slush. The mule picked its way carefully, its small hooves finding purchase where a horse might have slipped. Roberts rode with a slouch, his hat pulled low over his eyes to shield them from the glare of the sun reflecting off the patches of snow. He scanned the tree line constantly. He was a man who had survived by noticing things that were out of place. A snapped twig, a sudden silence in the birdsong, fresh tracks crossing the trail. He saw nothing but the rugged beauty of the wilderness, but the tension in his gut remained. He knew the Regulators were out there. He had heard the stories of Morton and Baker. He knew there was no mercy in Dick Brewer's posse, only a cold arithmetic balancing of the books. He camped that night in a dense thicket of pine far off the main trail. He did not light a fire. The smoke would be a beacon and the light would ruin his night vision. He ate cold biscuits and dried beef, chewing slowly, his ears tuned to the darkness. The woods were full of sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of a rodent in the underbrush, the wind groaning through the branches. Every noise was catalogued and dismissed only after rigorous mental scrutiny. He slept in short bursts, waking with a start, his hand instantly finding the grip of his revolver. It was the sleep of the hunted. By the next day, the landscape began to change as he descended toward the Tularosa Valley. The air grew slightly warmer, thick with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Roberts encountered a few travelers on the road, men driving wagons or riding alone. He exchanged brief nods, keeping his distance. Conversation was a risk. Information was a currency he could not afford to spend. He did not ask for news, and he volunteered none. He was a ghost passing through, a man trying to fade out of the picture before the shutter snapped. He thought of the check waiting for him at the mill. It was a tangible object, a piece of paper that held the promise of freedom. Without it, he was a destitute drifter. With it, he was a man of means. The necessity of that check drove him forward, overruling the instinct that told him to bypass the settlement and keep riding west. He reasoned that he could ride in, grab his mail, and be gone in 10 minutes. The mill was neutral ground. Dr. Blazer, the Indian agent who ran the post, was a man respected by both sides. Surely the war would not spill onto the agency grounds. It was a calculated risk, a gamble that the timing would favor him. On the trail, Roberts checked his weapons again. He pulled the Colt revolver from his holster. It was a single-action army, a heavy piece of steel that balanced the lethality of his rifle. He spun the cylinder, checking the metal, cartridges. He wanted to be sure that if he was cornered, he would not be taken easily. He had determined long ago that he would not submit to a lynch mob. If the regulators came for him, they would have to kill him. He would not be dragged into the woods and executed like a dog. He would die on his feet or at least with a gun in his hand. This resolve gave him a strange sense of calm. The worst-case scenario was death, and death was a familiar companion. As he neared the vicinity of the mill, he stopped to water the mule at a creek. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. He drank from his cupped hands, the shock of the cold water clearing his head. He looked at his reflection in a pool of still water. He saw a face lined by sun and wind, a beard that was graying, eyes that were tired. He looked like exactly what about he was, a relic of a harder time, trying to survive in a world that was becoming increasingly insane. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve and remounted. He navigated the final miles with heightened caution. The trail wound through canyons where ambush sites were plentiful. He kept the mule to the inside of the path, hugging the rock walls to minimize his profile. He watched the ridgelines for the silhouette of lookouts. He saw none. The valley seemed peaceful, the silence broken only by the sound of the wind and the rhythmic strike of the mule's hooves. It was a deception, a tranquil surface hiding the currents of violence moving underneath. Roberts was not a man given to introspection, but the solitude of the ride forced his mind to wander. He thought of the friends he had lost, the skirmishes he had survived. He wondered if this was how it ended for men like him, alone on a muddy trail running from a fight he didn't start. He pushed the thought away. Regret was a luxury. Survival was a job. He focused on the task at hand. Get to the mill, get the check, get out. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley floor. The light turned golden, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Roberts urged the mule into a faster walk. He wanted to reach the vicinity of the mill before dark, but not enter it until he had scouted the area. He would find a spot to camp nearby, watch the traffic, and make his move when the coast looked clear. He was patient. He had nowhere to be but away. He reached a vantage point overlooking the valley where the Tularosa flowed. In the distance, he could not yet see the mill, but he knew it was there, nestled in the trees. He felt a pull toward it, the magnetic attraction of the exit strategy. He checked the load in his carbine one last time. He patted the neck of the mule. "Easy," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. The animal flicked an ear backward. They were a team of two, outcasts navigating a hostile geography. Robert set up a cold camp as twilight fell. He sat with his back against a boulder, his rifle across his lap. He watched the stars emerge, hard white points of light in the black void. He did not know that miles away, 13 men were also making camp, their trajectory set to intersect with his own. He did not know that his name was on a list in Dick Brewer's pocket. He only knew that the night was cold. His shoulder ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, and he was ready for it to be over. He closed his eyes, listening to the breathing of the mule and the wind in the pines, waiting for the sun to rise on what he hoped would be his last day in Lincoln County. He shifted his position against the granite, the rock sucking the warmth from his coat. The night was not merely a passage of time, but a tactical phase he had to endure. He thought about the geography of Blazer's Mill. It was a complex of buildings, the sawmill itself, the trading post, the agent's house, the scattered dwellings of the workers. It was a labyrinth of cover and concealment. If trouble started there, it would be close quarters work. He mentally rehearsed the layout, visualizing the angles of fire from the porch of the post office, the cover offered by the lumber stacks. He had been there before. He knew the ground. This visualization was a habit from the war, a way of preloading his reactions so that if the moment came, he wouldn't have to think, only act. The pain in his shoulder flared as the temperature dropped. He reached into his coat and massaged the scar tissue, feeling the hard lumps of the buckshot under the skin. It was a constant companion, a barometer of the weather and his own mortality. He had learned to live with the limitation, to swing his body instead of his arm, to use the momentum of his torso to bring the gun to bear. It was an ugly, jerking motion, but it was fast. He had surprised men before who thought a cripple was easy prey. He hoped he wouldn't have to surprise anyone tomorrow. The silence of the wilderness was absolute, yet full of implied threats. Roberts knew that the Regulators were not the only danger. The Apaches were active in the area, moving through the mountains like smoke. A lone rider was a prime target for a raiding party. He kept his senses dialed to the frequency of the wild, filtering out the natural sounds of the night from the artificial sounds of man or horse. A snapping branch could be a deer, or it could be a scout. A rolling stone could be gravity or a boot. He trusted nothing. He thought of the men he might face. He knew them by reputation, if not by personal acquaintance. Billy the Kid. The name was starting to circulate, a young punk with a quick trigger. Dick Brewer, a man of righteous anger, dangerous because he believed he was doing God's work. The Coes, farmers turned fighters, fighting for their land and their lives. Roberts bore them no specific ill will, but he knew they would show him none. In a war without uniforms, the enemy is just the man standing in your way. And tomorrow they might be standing between him and his future. As dawn approached, the sky turned a pale, bruised gray. The frost lay thick on his blanket. Roberts rose stiffly, his joints protesting the cold. He saddled the mule in the half-light, his fingers clumsy on the buckles. He did not eat. His stomach was a tight knot of anticipation. He drank a mouthful of water and mounted up. The mule snorted, its breath a white cloud in the gloom. They began the final leg of the journey to the Tularosa. The descent was treacherous. The trail dropped sharply, winding through stands of ponderosa pine and scrub oak. The mud was frozen hard, crusted with ice that cracked under the mule's weight. Roberts kept his eyes moving, scanning the trail ahead. The ridges above, the brush to the sides. He was a camera recording every detail, looking for the anomaly that would signal an ambush. He saw the tracks of deer, the scat of a coyote, the scratch marks of a bear. He saw no horseshoe prints. The trail was clean. He reached the valley floor as the sun crested the mountains, flooding the world with a harsh, revealing light. The Tularosa River was a ribbon of silver winding through the brown grass. The air warmed slightly, the frost melting into dew. Roberts adjusted his hat. He checked the position of his pistol. He loosened the carbine in its scabbard. He was close now. He could smell the wood smoke from the chimneys at the mill. He could hear the distant whine of the saw blade biting into timber. It was the sound of civilization, of industry. It sounded like safety. He slowed the mule to a walk. He did not want to ride in with dust flying. He wanted to arrive casually, just another customer coming for his mail. He composed his face into a mask of indifference. He buried the tension deep in his gut. He was Andrew Roberts, a man of no consequence, just passing through. He repeated this lie to himself as the buildings of Blazer's mill came into view through the trees. He saw the large two-story house of Dr. Blazer. He saw the scattering of adobe huts. He saw the post office. It looked quiet. It looked normal. He did not see the 13 horses that would soon be tied to the rail. He did not see the rifles that would soon be propped against the wall. He saw only the destination. He nudged the mule forward, crossing the invisible line that separated the open range from the killing ground. He was a man with nothing left to lose, riding toward a moment that would demand everything he had left. The date was March 25th. The clock was ticking. The trap was not yet set, but the pieces were moving. And Roberts, the crippled veteran on the mule, was riding straight into the center of the board. April 2nd, 1878. The geography of Lincoln County was a vast, indifferent board upon which the players of the war were mere specks of dust moving slowly across a landscape of high desert and alpine timber. On this Tuesday, the spatial separation between the 13 Regulators and the lone rider Andrew Roberts began to collapse with the mathematical certainty of a closing equation. The Regulators riding west from the Rio Pecos and the Hondo Valley were cutting a jagged line through the foothills of the Capitan Mountains. They were a formidable column, a heavy fist of cavalry projecting the will of the Tunstall-McSween faction into the heart of the territory. The weather remained unseasonably aggressive, the wind screaming down from the summits with a velocity that stung the eyes and cracked the lips of the men. The sun offered illumination but little warmth, hanging in a sky of hard porcelain blue that seemed to stretch forever over the brown earth. Dick, Brewer rode at the head of the formation, his posture rigid, his eyes constantly sweeping the horizon for the dust signature of a sheriff's posse or a darker threat. He was a man consumed by the logistics of the manhunt. Moving 13 men and horses through hostile country required more than just anger. It required water, forage, and a constant vigilance against ambush. The group moved at a steady trot, a pace designed to cover ground without breaking the wind of the mounts. The sound of their passage was a rhythmic cacophony of iron horseshoes striking volcanic rock, the squeak of dry saddle leather, and the jingle of bit chains. Each man carried the dust of 3 counties in the creases of his clothing. Their dusters were coated in a fine tan powder that turned to mud where it met the sweat of their necks. Behind Brewer rode the core of the iron-willed squad. Frank McNabb, the cattle detective, rode with a Winchester resting across his pommel, his thumb tracing the hammer spur. He watched the tree lines with the professional paranoia of a man who made his living finding things that did not want to be found. Doc Scurlock, his face dark and contemplative, rode alongside Charlie Beaudre. Beaudre was the noise in the silence, often humming or whistling low. A habit that annoyed some but broke the monotony of the ride. He checked his weapons constantly, pulling his revolver to wipe dust from the cylinder flutes, treating the mechanism with the care others might reserve for a child. The co-cousins George and Frank rode near the rear, their eyes on the back trail. They were farmers pulled into a war, their hands calloused from the plow, now gripping the stocks of rifles. They knew the land intimately, every draw and arroyo a potential trap or haven. The terrain they traversed was a torture test for livestock. The ground was uneven, littered with loose shale and hidden gopher holes that could snap a cannon bone in an instant. The horses, a mix of hardy mustangs and ranch-bred geldings, labored under the weight of the men and their gear. Their coats were matted with sweat despite the cold white lather forming where the reins touched their necks. The men could smell the animals, a pungent mix of wet hair and ammonia that clung to the air. Every few miles Brewer signaled a halt. The men would dismount, checking hooves for stones, loosening cinches to let the horses breathe. They drank tepid water from canteens that tasted of tin, their eyes never stopping the scan of the perimeter. They were heading toward the Mescalero Apache Indian Agency at Blazer's Mill. The intelligence they had gathered from sympathizers along the Hondo suggested that the remnants of the boys, the loose confederation of outlaws and gunmen employed by the house, were gravitating toward the agency. It was a natural hub, a place of commerce and communication in a wilderness of isolation. Brewer intended to sweep the area to check the faces of every man at the trading post against the list of names seared into his memory. The warrant in his pocket was getting tattered, the edges fraying from constant handling, but the authority it represented was the only shield they had against being branded outlaws themselves. Miles to the west, Andrew Roberts continued his solitary trek. He was approaching the Tularosa Basin from a different angle, navigating the steep, pine-choked trails that led down from the high country. His progress was slower, dictated by the capabilities of his mule and the pain in his body. The cold front that buffeted the Regulators was even more severe at his elevation. Ice clung to the branches of the ponderosa pines, and patches of snow still lay deep in the shadows of the north-facing slopes. Roberts wore every piece of clothing he owned, layers of wool and canvas trying to trap his body heat. His bad shoulder ached with a deep, bone-level throb that synchronized with the mule's gait. He rode with his right arm tucked close to his body, minimizing the movement of the damaged joint. Roberts was not hunting, he was transiting. His mind was focused on the check waiting for him at Blazer's mill. He visualized the transaction, riding in, dismounting, walking into the office, signing the receipt, taking the payment and riding out. It was a simple sequence, a bureaucratic period at the end of a violent sentence. He did not know that 13 men were riding to intercept that very location. He stopped at midday to let the mule graze on a patch of dried bunch grass. He sat on a fallen log, eating a strip of jerky that was as tough as boot leather. He chewed methodically, his eyes watching a hawk circle in the updraft. The solitude was absolute. There was no sound of other riders, no distant gunshots, only the wind sighing through the needles of the pines. It was a false peace, the quiet before the hammer falls. Back with the Regulators, the conversation during the ride was sparse and functional. They spoke of water, sources, of the condition of the horses, of the likelihood of finding their quarry. William Bonney, the youngest of the group, rode with a loose, easy grace that belied the tension of the mission. He was often smiling, a rictus that did not quite reach his eyes. He practiced his draw when he thought no one was watching, his hand blurring to his hip and back. He was eager for the confrontation, viewing the war not just as a duty but as a stage. The older men watched him with a mixture of amusement and concern. They knew that enthusiasm was no substitute for experience, but they also knew that the kid had ice in his veins when the shooting started. As the afternoon wore on, the Regulators crossed into the drainage of the Tularosa. The landscape began to change, the scrub brush giving way to larger timber as they neared the river. The Tularosa was a lifeline in the desert, a ribbon of water that supported the sawmill and the agency. The trail widened, showing signs of recent traffic. Wagon ruts cut deep into the mud, the prints of shod horses, the drag marks of travois. Brewer halted the column to examine the tracks. He dismounted, squatting in the dirt, his fingers tracing the impressions. He looked for the specific shoe prints of the horses ridden by the men they were hunting. It was an inexact science, but Brewer had an eye for detail. He saw nothing definitive, just the chaotic record of a busy thoroughfare. The group pressed on, the anticipation building as the miles to the mill decreased. They checked their weapons again, a ritual that bordered on superstition. They topped off magazines, sliding the .44 caliber cartridges into the loading gates of their Winchesters. They checked the metal cartridges in their revolvers. Scurlock tightened the cinch on his saddle, ensuring his platform would be stable if he had to fight mounted. The co-cousins exchanged a look, a silent communication between kin that acknowledged the danger ahead. They were riding into a federal agency, a place where the jurisdiction was murky and the presence of the U.S. Army was a constant possibility. To engage in a gunfight, there was to invite the wrath of the government, but the Regulators were past the point of caring about jurisdiction. They were operating on the law of the gun. Roberts, meanwhile, had begun his descent into the valley proper. The air grew thicker, richer with oxygen as he lost altitude. He could see the smoke from the mill in the distance, a gray smudge against the blue sky. He felt a surge of relief. The destination was in sight. He urged the mule forward, the animal sensing the proximity of water and rest. Roberts ran through his mental checklist again. He would keep his rifle in the scabbard but the flap unbuckled. He would keep his coat unbuttoned at the bottom to allow access to his pistol. He was not expecting a fight, but he was prepared for one. The instinct that had kept him alive through the war and the frontier. Violence was screaming at him to be careful, to watch the corners, to check six. The sun began to dip toward the western horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the trail. The light turned golden, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The temperature began to drop rapidly as the heat of the day radiated back into space. The regulators pulled their collars up, huddling into their coats. They were tired. Their backs ached, their knees were stiff, their eyes were gritty with dust. But they did not stop. They wanted to reach the vicinity of the mill before dark, to set up a perimeter and watch the night traffic. They were the wolves circling the herd, looking for the straggler. As the two parties drew closer, the landscape seemed to funnel them together. The trails converged toward the single point of the agency. The Tularosa River, swollen with snowmelt, roared nearby, the sound of the water masking the approach of the horses. The regulators rode in silence now, the banter gone. They were in tactical mode, spacing out the line to prevent a single ambush from taking them all. Brewer signaled with his hand, directing the men to stay off the skyline, to use the contours of the land for concealment. They moved like a military patrol, disciplined and deadly. Roberts reached the river a few miles upstream from the mill. He let the mule drink, the animal burying its muzzle in the cold current. Roberts splashed water on his face, washing away the sweat and grime of the journey. He looked at his reflection in the water, seeing the gray in his beard, the lines around his eyes. He looked old. He felt old. He wondered if the check would be enough to buy a quiet life somewhere warm, somewhere where the wind didn't cut like a knife. He remounted, the wet leather of the saddle squeaking. The distance between the 13 and the 1 was now measured in mere miles. They were sharing the same air, seeing the same mountains, hearing the same wind. The invisible threads of fate were pulling them tight. The regulators were fueled by a righteous vengeance, a belief that they were the agents of justice in a lawless land. Roberts was fueled by a desperate need for survival, a desire to escape the trap that was closing around him. Neither side knew the exact position of the other, but they could feel the presence of the enemy in the tension of the air. The sun touched the mountains, setting the peaks on fire with red and orange light. The valley floor fell into shadow. The regulators pushed their horses into a canter, wanting to cover the last stretch of open ground before the light failed completely. The thundering of 52 hooves echoed off the canyon walls, a sound like distant thunder. They were a force of nature, unstoppable and unyielding. They rode with the arrogance of numbers, confident that 13 guns could handle any problem they encountered. Roberts rode slowly, the mule picking its way through the deepening gloom. He was cautious, stopping often to listen. He heard nothing but the river and the wind. He did not hear the approaching storm of the regulators. He was a man walking through a minefield in the dark, unaware that the triggers were all around him. He thought about where he would sleep that night. He decided he would not stay at the mill itself. It was too public, too dangerous. He would get his mail and then ride out a few miles to camp in the woods. It was a sound plan, a survivor's plan. But plans in Lincoln County were often worth less than the paper they were written on. As night fully descended, the regulators pulled up short of the mill, establishing a bivouac in a grove of cottonwoods. They were close enough to see the lights of the buildings, to smell the wood smoke. They did not light fires. They ate cold rations again, chewing in the dark. They set watches, men taking turns to stare into the blackness, listening for the sound of riders. They were the hunters in the blind, waiting for the game to appear. Roberts made his own camp a few miles away on the opposite side of the agency. He, too, lay in the dark, listening. The proximity of the two camps was a coincidence of geography and timing. They were separated by a few miles of rough country, but they were connected by the inevitability of the coming conflict. The night passed slowly, the cold seeping into the bones of the men on the ground. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent witnesses to the violence that was preparing to unleash itself. In the silence of the bivouac, Frank Coe whispered to his cousin George. He spoke of the farm, of the crops they were neglecting to chase outlaws. George nodded in the dark, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. They were weary of the war, but they were committed. They could not go back. The blood on their hands bound them to the group. They had to see it through to the end. Roberts lay awake, his shoulder throbbing. He stared at the canopy of pine branches above him, black, lace against the stars. He had a bad feeling, a knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. It was the intuition of a man who had been shot before, a premonition of pain. He checked the position of his rifle one last time, his hand resting on the cold steel of the receiver. It was his only friend in the world. The night of April 2nd was a long, cold wait. The wind died down, leaving a heavy silence over the valley. The river rushed on, oblivious to the men sleeping on its banks. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The convergence was complete. All that remained was for the sun to rise and the players to make their moves. The 13 regulators, heavily armed and authorized by a piece of paper, lay waiting for the morning to spring their trap. Andrew Roberts, the crippled veteran on a mule, slept fitfully, dreaming of a peace that he would never find. The next 2 days would determine who lived and who died, but on this night they were just men sleeping on the hard ground, united by the cold and the dark and the terrible gravity of the gun. The horses picketed nearby shifted their weight, their ears rotating to catch the sounds of the night. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, wavering cry that echoed off the canyon walls. It was answered by another and then another, a chorus of wild song that seemed to mock the silent men. The wilderness was alive, watching, waiting. The convergence on the Tularosa was not just a meeting of men, it was a collision of forces, a grinding together of history and violence that would leave a permanent scar on the land. The sun would rise on April 3rd, bringing them one day closer to the sawmill, one day closer to the doorway, one day closer to the grave. April 4th, 1878. The sun crested the Sacramento Mountains, casting a pale, deceptive warmth over the Tularosa Valley. It was a Thursday morning, quiet and crisp, the kind of day that usually signaled the beginning of the spring thaw. At Blazer's Mill, the daily rhythm of the agency was just beginning to stir. The mill itself, a large structure powered by the diverted waters of the Tularosa River, sat silent. The great circular saw blade cold and motionless. The air smelled of wet pine sawdust, wood smoke, and the damp earth of the riverbank. This location served as the Mescalero Apache Indian Agency, a hub of government activity, commerce, and communication in a region otherwise defined by isolation. Dr. Joseph H. Blazer, a dentist by trade and the Indian agent by appointment, moved through his domain with the assumption of authority, unaware that his property was about to be commandeered by a force that recognized no authority but the gun. The silence of the morning was broken not by the whine of the saw, but by the heavy rhythmic thudding of hooves on hard-packed dirt. The 13 regulators rode into the agency grounds with the confidence of an occupying army. They did not sneak in. They arrived in a column, their horses blowing steam in the cool air, the leather of their saddles creaking under the weight of heavily armed men. They swept into the central yard, the open space between the main house, the mill, and the scattered outbuildings. The arrival was a physical assertion of power. They controlled the space simply by occupying it. Dick Brewer, riding at the front, raised a hand to halt the group. The horses stomped and shifted, sensing the tension of their riders. Brewer surveyed the layout with a tactical eye. The agency was a collection of structures that offered both cover and entrapment. The main house was a large, 2-story adobe building with a porch that ran along the front. To the east lay the sawmill, a sprawling structure of timber and iron. Scattered around were smaller adobes, corrals, and the trading post. The river cut through the property, a natural barrier that limited movement to the north. Brewer saw it as a defensible position, a place where they could rest, eat, and watch the approaches. The men dismounted in a wave of dust and motion. They tied their horses to the hitching rails and fence posts, loosening cinches but leaving the saddles on. A horse with a loose cinch could rest, but a horse with no saddle was useless in an emergency. They pulled their Winchester rifles from the scabbards, the long guns never leaving their hands or the immediate reach of their owners. The metallic clatter of lever actions being checked and hammers being eased down echoed off the adobe walls. These were men who treated their weapons as primary limbs, more essential than a left hand or a right foot. Dr. Blazer emerged from the main house, stepping onto the porch to confront the intrusion. He was a man, accustomed to dealing with the bureaucracy of the Department of the Interior and the volatility of the Apaches. But the sight of 13 hardened gunmen gave him pause. He recognized many of them. In a community as small as Lincoln County, anonymity was impossible. He saw the badges they wore, the tin stars that proclaimed them to be constables and deputies, but he also saw the look in their eyes that spoke of a mandate far exceeding the arrest of cattle thieves. Brewer approached the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. He informed Blazer that they were there on official business, serving warrants for the arrest of the men who had killed John Tunstall. He did not ask for permission to stay. He stated his intention. They were hungry, they were tired, and they intended to take a meal at the agency before continuing their patrol. It was a demand masked as a request. Blazer, calculating the odds of 13 against 1, nodded. He was a pragmatist. He invited them to eat at the table of Mrs. Godfroy, the wife of the agency clerk, who ran the kitchen for the employees and visitors. The Regulators moved toward the dining hall, a side building or attached room often used for communal meals. They walked with a swagger that came from numerical superiority. They left a few men outside to watch the horses in the perimeter, a rotating guard duty that ensured they would not be caught unawares. The men entering the house removed their hats but kept their gun belts strapped tight to their waists. The heavy Colt revolvers bumped against the door frames and the chairs as they settled in. The room felt instantly smaller, filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and gun oil. Mrs. Godfroy and her helpers moved quickly to accommodate the guests. The Frontier Hospitality Code demanded that travelers be fed, regardless of their political affiliation or the warrants they carried. Plates of venison, beans, and cornbread were laid out on the long wooden table. A large pot of coffee, black and scalding hot, was placed in the center. The men ate with the voracious appetite of those who had been living on trail rations for weeks. They tore into the bread and shoveled beans into their mouths, washing it down with mugs of coffee. The clinking of silverware on tin plates was the only sound for several minutes, a frantic consumption of calories to fuel the machine of the body. While they ate, the conversation was low and guarded. They spoke of the trail they had just covered, of the weather, of the quality of the horses. They did not speak of the killing they had done or the killing they planned to do. That was understood, a silent current running beneath the surface of the meal. Billy the Kid sat near the end of the table, his eyes darting around the room, taking in every detail. He was restless, his energy contained only by the social convention of the meal. He ate quickly, his hands moving with a dexterity that hinted at his skill with a pistol. Outside, the guards patrolled the perimeter of the agency. They walked the fence lines, checking the approaches from the road that ran through the valley. The geography of Blazer's Mill created a natural choke point. The road descended from the mountains, crossed the Tularosa, and passed directly through the cluster of buildings before continuing on. Anyone traveling through the region had to pass through this needle's eye. The regulators knew this. By occupying the mill, they had turned the agency into a toll booth where the currency was identification. They were not just resting, they were fishing. The layout of the trap was unintentional but effective. The horses were tied in the open, visible to anyone approaching. This served as a lure or a warning depending on who was riding in. The bulk of the regulators were inside, hidden from view, ready to spill out at the first sign of trouble. The kill box was the open yard between the buildings. It was a flat, dusty arena surrounded by cover, the heavy logs of the sawmill, the thick adobe walls of the house, the stacks of lumber drying in the sun. Any man caught in that open space would be exposed to fire from multiple angles with nowhere to hide. As the morning progressed, the men finished their meal and began to relax. They drifted out to the porch and the yard, enjoying the sun and the digestion of a full stomach. Some leaned against the walls, rolling cigarettes with one hand. Others tended to their horses, checking hooves and tightening gear. The tension that had defined their ride began to dissipate slightly, replaced by a dangerous complacency. They felt secure in their numbers. They were the law, and they were the power. Who would dare challenge 13 heavily armed deputies in broad daylight? Dr. Blazer moved among them, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He spoke with Brewer, asking about the news from Lincoln. He was careful not to antagonize them, but he was anxious for them to leave. The presence of the regulators was a liability. If the sheriff's posse arrived, the agency would become a battlefield. Blazer had families living on the property, workers, and the Apaches who came to the agency for rations. He wanted the storm to pass without lightning striking his home. The regulators, however, were in no hurry. They had nowhere specific to be until a lead presented itself. They decided to wait, to let the day warm up, to let the horses rest fully. They turned the agency into a temporary headquarters. They inspected the mill, looking at the machinery with the curiosity of men who worked with their hands. They checked the sight lines from the porch, noting how the road curved down the hill. They were comfortable. They owned the ground. Inside the trading post, the clerk worked quietly, eyeing the gunmen through the window. The commerce of the agency had ground to a halt. No one wanted to conduct business with a posse lurking in the yard. The local Apaches stayed away, sensing the bad medicine in the air. The birds seemed to have gone silent. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with the static electricity of potential violence. At roughly 11 in the morning, the sun was high and bright. The shadows had shortened, removing the hiding places around the yard. The regulators were scattered, some inside the house finishing coffee, some on the porch, some by the corrals. They were not in a defensive formation. They were loose, confident. They believed they were the hunters, and the hunters did not fear the woods. Frank McNabb stood by the corner of the house, looking up the road. He was a man who trusted his eyes more than his gut. He scanned the tree line, looking for movement. The road was empty. The dust lay undisturbed. It seemed like a quiet day in the Tularosa Valley. The only sound was the rushing of the river, a constant white noise that masked the approach of anything smaller than a wagon train. Dick Brewer came out to the porch, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. He looked at his men. They looked ready. He thought about the list in his pocket. Buckshot Roberts was on it, but Brewer had no specific intelligence that Roberts was coming here today. It was just a possibility, one of many. The primary goal was to intercept anyone from the Dolan faction moving goods or information. Roberts was a secondary target, a loose end to be tied off if the opportunity arose. The trap was set, not by grand design, but by the simple physics of occupation. 13 guns were distributed around a central point. 13 pairs of eyes were watching the world. The agency had become a fortress without a flag. The walls were adobe, the moat was the Tularosa, and the garrison was a group of men who had decided that the only way to survive was to kill first. The smells of the morning shifted. The coffee scent faded, replaced by the smell of heating earth and horse manure. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry leaves of the cottonwoods. It was a mundane scene, a tableau of frontier life that hid the jagged edges of the war. To a casual observer, it might have looked like a social gathering, a group of riders stopping for a chat. But the Winchesters leaning against the wall and the Colts hanging low on hips told a different story. Inside the house, Charlie Bowder was joking with the cousins. They were laughing, a harsh sound that broke the tension. They were young men, and youth has a way of denying mortality. They felt invincible. They had the law on their side, or at least the version of the law that Brewer carried. They had the firepower, they had the camaraderie of the shared hunt. They did not know that the hunt was about to turn back on them. The trap waited. It was a passive beast, a collection of angles and lines of fire waiting for a trigger. The sawdust in the mill yard was dry and pale, ready to drink whatever was spilled on it. The door frames of the buildings were sturdy, offering hard cover. The windows were firing ports. The geography of Blazer's mill was neutral, but the men who occupied it had charged it with lethal intent. As noon approached, the Regulators began to think about moving on. The horses were rested. The men were fed. There was no reason to stay unless something happened. They checked their watches. They adjusted their hats. They began the slow process of remobilizing, tightening cinches, checking loads. It was the moment of transition, the point where the static energy of the weight transforms into the kinetic energy of the ride. But they did not leave. A lethargy held them, a reluctance to leave the comfort of the agency for the cold trail. They lingered, and in that lingering the trap remained open. The jaws were wide, the teeth were sharp, and the bait was the simple fact of their presence. They were the anomaly in the landscape, the disruption that would draw the reaction. Dr. Blazer watched them from his office window. He counted them again, 13. It was an unlucky number, a superstition that even a man of science could not entirely dismiss in the West. He wished them gone. He wished for the quiet whine of his saw and the orderly conduct of his agency. He did not know that his wish would be granted only after his mill was turned into a slaughterhouse. The dirt of the yard was marked by the boots of the Regulators. They had paced, stood, and spat tobacco juice into the dust. They had claimed the territory. The air above the agency was invisible, but if one could see the lines of tension, they would look like a spider web stretched tight across the valley, vibrating with the slightest touch. The men checked their weapons one last time. It was a nervous habit, a tick. They worked the levers, feeling the smooth mechanical action. They spun the cylinders. They were ready for a fight, even if they didn't expect one right this second. The preparation was constant. The mindset was permanent. They were Regulators. They regulated. And so the stage was fully dressed. The lighting was the high, harsh sun of midday. The set was the adobe and timber of the mill. The cast was in position, waiting for the final actor to make his entrance. The trap at Blazer's mill was a physical reality, a confluence of 13 killers in a single location, creating a density of violence that was critical mass. All that was needed was a spark. The sound of the river continued, indifferent. The mountains stood watch, silent. The Regulators waited, their bellies full, their eyes hard. The morning of April 4th had passed without a shot fired. The peace of the valley held, fragile as a sheet of ice on a spring pond. But the weight of 13 men was too much for the ice to bear. It was about to crack. Dick Brewer walked the perimeter again, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. He walked past the large pile of logs near the sawmill, the timber stripped of bark and cured, waiting for the blade. He did not know that, This woodpile would become a tombstone. He looked at the doorway of the main house, a thick portal of heavy wood and iron hinges. He did not know that this doorway would become a fortress. He was surveying the ground, but he was seeing it as a campsite, not a battlefield. He missed the lethality of the angles because he was looking outward, not inward. He stopped to talk to John Middleton. Middleton was a steady hand, a man who could be relied upon. They spoke of the warrants. Brewer was obsessed with the paper. He needed the legitimacy. He tapped his breast pocket where the documents lay. He told Middleton that they would sweep the road south toward the Sacramento Pass. They would check every traveler. They would turn the county upside down. Middleton nodded, shifting his rifle from one shoulder to the other. He was ready to ride. Inside the dining room, the smell of the meal lingered. Mrs. Godfroy cleared the plates, the clatter of tin loud in the quiet room. She moved around the armed men with a stoic efficiency. She had seen violence before, it was a part of the landscape. But this felt different. These men were not just passing through, they were hunting. She could see it in the way they sat, facing the doors and windows. She could see it in the way they kept their hands free. She poured more coffee, a silent offering to keep the peace. Frank Coe stepped out of the house and walked toward the mill. He had a connection to the area. He knew the people. He felt a strange unease. The waiting was the hardest part. The adrenaline of the ride had faded, leaving behind the dull ache of fatigue. He sat on a bench near the mill race, watching the water rush by. It was fast, cold, and relentless. It reminded him of the war they were in. Once the dam broke, there was no stopping the flood. You just had to try to keep your head above water. George Coe joined him. They sat in silence, brothers in arms and blood. They checked their pistols, wiping the dust from the sights. They were farmers, men who should have been planting corn, not ambushing neighbors. But the lines had been drawn. Tunstall was dead. The house was winning. They had to fight. There was no middle ground in Lincoln County. You were either a regulator or you were a target. The sun moved overhead, signaling the transition to afternoon. The shadows shifted, rotating around the buildings like the hands of a clock. The kill box of the yard was now fully illuminated. Every stone, every weed, every piece of refuse was visible. It was a stage lit for a tragedy. The regulators were the audience and the actors waiting for the play to begin. The horses at the rails swished their tails, driving away the early spring flies. They were the only ones who seemed relaxed. They dozed in the sun, one hind leg cocked, heads low. They were the innocents in this equation, the engines of war that had no stake in the outcome. Brewer gathered the men. It was time to make a decision. Stay or go. The consensus was to give it another hour. Let the horses digest. Let the men rest. The decision was casual, a matter of comfort. It was the decision that sealed the fate of the day. If they had left at noon, the history of the West would have been written differently. But they stayed. They poured another cup of coffee. They rolled another cigarette. They waited. The trap solidified. It was no longer just a location, it was a moment in time. The coordinates were locked. Blazers Mill, April 4th, midday. The variables were set. 13 men, heavily armed, relaxed but ready. The trigger was approaching. The air grew still, the wind dying down as if holding its breath. The valley waited. The mill waited. The regulators waited, and down the road, the mule carrying the man with the crippled shoulder plodded closer, one step at a time, bringing the spark to the powder keg. The sun sat directly overhead, a blinding white disk that bleached the color from the Tularosa Valley. The shadows that had stretched long in the morning had retracted, hiding beneath the eaves of the buildings and the bellies of the horses. It was the middle of the day, the hour when the frontier typically paused for the midday meal, a brief suspension of labor before the afternoon grind. Andrew Roberts rode his mule down the final slope of the trail that led to Blazer's mill, the animal moving with a steady, rocking gait that jostled the man's injured shoulder. He was tired. The ride from his camp had been short in distance but long in duration due to the caution he employed. He crested the rise that overlooked the agency grounds, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat to assess the situation below. The scene that greeted him appeared at first glance to be one of routine commerce. The mill stood silent, the water from the flume, splashing loudly into the tail race, a sound that dominated the auditory landscape. Smoke rose in a straight column from the chimney of the main house, signaling that the kitchen was active. Roberts nudged the mule forward, the animal's hooves clattering on the loose stones of the road. He did not see the danger immediately. His focus was on the logistics of his errand. Dismount, enter the office, retrieve his check from Dr. Blazer, and depart. He had rehearsed this sequence repeatedly, a mental script designed to minimize his exposure to the public. As he descended into the yard, the details of the scene sharpened. He saw the hitching rail in front of the agency office and the guest house. It was crowded. A line of horses stood tied there, their heads low, tails swatting at flies. Roberts pulled on the reins, halting the mule 50 yards out. He studied the animals. These were not the ponies of the local Mescalero Apaches, nor were they the draft animals of the mill workers. These were saddle horses rigged for travel and war. He saw the heavy leather saddles, the Winchesters in scabbards, the bedrolls tied tight. He recognized the brands on some, the specific tack on others. A cold realization washed over him, a physical sensation that started in his gut and radiated out to his extremities. He knew these horses, he knew the men who rode them. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to turn the mule around, to kick the beast into a gallop and flee back up the trail. But the tactical part of his brain, the part honed by years of combat, countermanded the order. To turn his back now was to invite a volley of rifle fire. The mule was slow. The horses at the rail were fast. If he ran, they would run him down within a mile. If he turned, he presented a massive retreating target. His only option, the only path that offered a sliver of survival, was to brazen it out. He had to assume they had not seen him yet, or that if they had, they might hesitate to shoot a man who rode openly into their camp. It was a gamble on the psychology of the mob. Roberts kicked the mule forward again. He rode straight toward the building, his posture stiff. He loosened the carbine in its scabbard, ensuring it would slide free with a single motion. He unbuttoned the lower flap of his coat, clearing the path to his pistol. He adopted a look of grim determination, a mask to hide the fear that was spiking his heart rate. He rode past the sawmill, the smell of fresh sawdust thick in his nostrils. He rode past the stacks of lumber, the yellow wood gleaming in the sun. He entered the open yard, the space that the Regulators had unwittingly turned into an arena. He steered the mule toward the side of the house, away from the main cluster of horses, trying to keep a semblance of distance. He halted the animal and swung his leg over the saddle, dropping to the ground with a grunt of pain as his boots hit the hard earth. He did not tie the mule. He left the reins trailing, a silent admission that he might need to leave in a hurry. He pulled his Winchester Model 1873 from the scabbard. He did not hold it in a threatening manner, but he held it ready, cradled in his left arm, his right hand near the trigger guard. He walked toward the porch, his spurs jingling with a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden quiet. Inside the dining room, the meal was winding down. The Regulators were leaning back in their chairs, picking their teeth, digesting the venison and cornbread. The sound of the mule's arrival had been masked by the noise of the river and the conversation. But as Roberts walked into the yard, his presence was noted. One of the men glancing out the window stiffened. He spoke a name that stopped all conversation. Roberts. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as men stood up, hands dropping to holsters. Winchesters were snatched from where they leaned against the wall. Dick Brewer, his face hardening, gave a sharp order. They had their man. Frank Coe was the first to move. He knew Roberts personally. They had been neighbors of a sort in the Ruidoso Valley. There was a familiarity between them that predated the war. Coe stepped out of the house, moving onto the porch with his hands visible, trying to de-escalate the immediate threat of violence. He walked down the steps and into the yard, intercepting Roberts before the older man could reach the door. The two men stood facing each other in the bright sunlight, the distance between them less than 10 paces. Roberts stopped. He looked at Coe, his eyes darting to the windows of the house where he could see the shadows of other men moving. He gripped his rifle tighter. He knew Frank Coe was not the most dangerous man in the group, but he was one of them. Coe spoke first, his voice calm, conversational. He asked Roberts to surrender. He told him that there was a warrant for his arrest, that the posse was legal, that they only wanted to take him in. It was a plea for sanity. Coe told him that there were 13 of them and only one of him. The math was simple. Roberts listened, his face a mask of granite. He shifted his weight, alleviating the pressure on his bad leg. He looked at Coe with a gaze that was devoid of hope, but full of resolve. He told Coe that he knew what surrender meant in Lincoln County. It meant being disarmed, bound, and then shot in the back on a lonely trail while trying to escape. He cited the fate of Morton and Baker. He cited the fate of McCloskey. He told Coe that he had no intention of being the next name on that list. He said he would not be taken alive. The conversation in the yard was a surreal bubble of diplomacy in a sea of impending violence. Coe pressed him, urging him to reconsider. He offered his own word, his personal guarantee of safety. He told Roberts that he would ride with him all the way to Lincoln, that he would ensure he stood trial before a judge, not a firing squad. Roberts laughed, a dry, bitter sound. He respected Coe enough to listen, but he did not trust the mob behind him. He pointed out that Coe could not control the others. He pointed out that Brewer and the kid were in that house, men who wanted blood, not justice. While they talked, the other regulators began to filter out of the house. They did not come out in a rush, but one by one, moving to flank the conversation. They fanned out along the porch and the side of the building, their rifles held at the low ready. They were positioning themselves, closing the angles, cutting off Roberts' retreat. Roberts saw them. He saw the way they moved, the way their eyes locked onto him. He saw the kid smiling, that vacuous smile, his hand resting on his pistol. He saw Brewer, grim and official. He saw Baudre twitching with anticipation. The tension in the yard grew with every second. The air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. The sound of the river faded into the background, replaced by the pounding of blood in Robert's ears. He realized that the talking was just a delay, a way for the regulators to get into position. He adjusted his grip on the Winchester. He moved his feet slightly, widening his stance, preparing for the recoil. He was a cornered animal, and the fight or flight response had locked firmly onto fight. Coe saw the shift in Robert's demeanor. He saw the muscles in the man's jaw tighten. He saw the finger move inside the trigger guard. He tried one last time. He pleaded with Roberts to put the gun down. He told him it didn't have to end this way. Roberts looked at him, and for a moment there was a flicker of regret in his eyes. He told Coe that he was a good man, but he was in bad company. He told him to step aside. The positioning of the men was now a semicircle of death. Roberts stood with his back to the sawmill, the open yard in front of him, the house to his right. He was exposed. There was no cover within 5 feet. His mule had wandered off slightly, grazing on a patch of weeds. He was alone. The physical reality of the situation was absolute. 13 rifles were pointed in his general direction. A single man stood against them. Roberts calculated his first move. He could not shoot them all. He had to take out the leader, or the most dangerous threat. He scanned the line. He saw Boder moving to his left, trying to get a flanking angle. He saw Brewer standing by the woodpile. He saw the others crowding the doorway. He knew that once the first shot was fired, the air would be filled with slugs. He had to make his shots count. He had to be perfect. The wind picked up, blowing dust across the yard. It stung Robert's eyes, but he did not blink. He kept his focus on the men in front of him. He was waiting for the signal, the sudden movement that would indicate the truce was over. He was ready to die, but he was determined to take as many of them with him as he could. He felt the weight of the buckshot in his shoulder, the old injury that defined his shooting style. He would have to shoot from the hip, a snapshot. He had practiced it 1,000 times. Now he would see if it worked. Frank Coe realized he was standing in the line of fire. He realized that his words had failed. He saw the look in Robert's eyes and knew that the man had made his peace with death. Coe stepped back, moving away from Roberts, creating the space that the violence required. He raised his hands, signaling that he was out of it. The negotiation was over. The diplomacy had failed. Roberts watched him go. He was now isolated in the center of the frame. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dry, dusty air. He looked at the faces of the men who had come to kill him. He memorized them. He wanted to know who he was sending to hell. He tightened his grip on the rifle stock. The wood felt warm in his hand. The metal was cold. The stillness of the moment was profound. It was the pause at the top of the roller coaster, the split second before gravity takes over. The birds had stopped singing. The world had shrunk down to the size of the mill yard. There was no past, no future, only the immediate, terrifying present. Andrew Roberts, the man with nothing left to lose, stood his ground. He did not tremble. He did not beg. He simply waited. Inside the house, Dr. Blazer watched from a window, his heart hammering in his chest. He saw the inevitable collision. He saw the fragility of the peace he had tried to maintain. He wanted to shout, to stop it, but he knew his voice would be drowned out. This was a matter for guns now. The regulators on the porch were restless. They were waiting for Brewer to give the word, or for Roberts to make a mistake. They were wolves who had cornered a badger, expecting an easy kill but wary of the claws. They underestimated the ferocity of the man they faced. They saw a cripple on a mule. They did not see the veteran who had walked through fire before. Roberts shifted his gaze to Charlie Boder. Boder was aggressive, moving closer, his weapon raised. Roberts identified him as the immediate threat. He locked his focus on Boder's chest. The geometry of the shot formed in his mind: distance, angle, elevation. It was automatic. The sun beat down, indifferent to the drama. The shadows of the men were black cutouts on the brown earth. The smell of the sawmill was overpowering, a scent of pine and resin that would forever be associated with death for the survivors. The timeline of the event had reached its terminal point. The words had all been spoken. The pleas had been rejected. The warrant was void. There was only the gun. Roberts whispered a curse under his breath. It was not a prayer. It was a condemnation. He was ready. The mule rider had arrived and he was not leaving. The trap had sprung, but the prey was fighting back. The silence stretched thin, vibrating with tension until it could hold no more. It was about to snap. The silence that held the agency yard at Blazer's Mill was a fragile membrane stretched to its absolute limit by the opposing pressures of 13 warrants and 1 refusal. Frank Coe had retreated to the periphery, his role as peacemaker evaporated by the hard reality of the standoff. The distance between Andrew Roberts and the cluster of regulators was no longer measured in yards, but in the time it took for a hammer to fall. The air was still, the dust settled, and the sun illuminated the scene with a clinical, shadowless clarity that exposed every twitch of a muscle and every bead of sweat. The negotiation was dead. The diplomacy of words had been replaced by the geometry of trajectories. Charlie Boder, standing near the corner of the house, broke the stillness. He was a man of action, his patience eroded by the stubbornness of the cripple on the mule. He stepped away from the wall, his weapon, a shotgun or perhaps a rifle, accounts would vary, but the effect was the same, leveled directly at Roberts. He did not ask for a surrender. He demanded it. He shouted a command that echoed off the adobe walls, ordering Roberts to throw up his hands. It was the standard challenge of the lawman, a final opportunity for the suspect to submit before the application of lethal force. But in the context of the Lincoln County War, it was also the starter pistol for the execution. Roberts looked at Boder. He did not raise his hands. His arms remained locked in their firing positions, his left cradling the forend of the Winchester, his right gripping the stock. His answer was immediate and devoid of hesitation. He stated clearly, "Not if I can help it." The words were barely out of his mouth when the physics of the situation collapsed. The time for talking had expired. The reaction was simultaneous, a spasm of violence that erupted from both men as if they shared a single nervous system. Boder fired. The report of his weapon was a deafening crack that shattered the quiet of the valley. The projectile, a heavy-caliber slug, bridged the gap between them in a fraction of a second. It struck Roberts in the midsection, entering the lower abdomen near the groin. The impact was catastrophic. The bullet tore through the layers of heavy clothing, punched through the skin and muscle, and plowed deep into the abdominal cavity. It was a wound that, in 1878, was universally regarded as fatal. It perforated the intestines, creating a massive internal trauma that would inevitably result in infection and a slow, agonizing death. The force of the strike was like a sledgehammer blow to the gut, a kinetic transfer of energy that should have knocked Roberts backward off his feet. Yet Roberts did not fall. In the same microsecond that Boder pulled his trigger, Roberts pulled his. The crippled veteran, shooting from the hip with his carbine held low against his body, unleashed a round with terrifying speed. His bullet, a .44-40 slug, flew true across the yard. It struck Boder in the center of his body, hitting the heavy metal buckle of his gun belt. The projectile smashed against the brass and leather, the impact deflecting the round. Instead of coring through Boder's stomach, the bullet glanced off the buckle and tore a furrow around his side, severing the belt and inflicting a painful, shock-inducing wound. The blow knocked the wind out of Boder, sending him stumbling backward, gasping for air, clutching at his midsection in the belief that he had been gutted. The two shots blended into a single rolling thunderclap. The space between the men filled instantly with the white-gray smoke of black powder. The sulphurous cloud expanded rapidly, obscuring the vision of the combatants. The smell of burnt propellant washed over the yard, an acrid metallic scent that stung the nostrils. The horses at the hitching rail panicked. They reared and pulled against their reins, their eyes rolling in terror, their hooves churning the dust into a frenzy. The noise was overwhelming. The boom of the guns, the scream of the horses, the shouts of men reacting to the sudden violence. For a heartbeat, the other regulators froze, their brains processing the fact that the shooting had actually started. They saw Boder stagger back, doubling over. They saw Roberts still standing, enveloped in smoke. Then the collective reflex took over. The remaining men unleashed a barrage of fire. Winchesters and Colts erupted from the porch, from the doorway, from the corner of the house. The air above the yard became a swarm of flying metal. Bullets zipped through the space where Roberts stood, kicking up spurts of dirt around his boots, smacking into the wood of the sawmill behind him with solid, splintering thuds. Roberts was hit, mortally wounded, his insides shredded, but the adrenaline of the combat kept him upright. The pain was a dull, massive pressure in his gut, a sickening realization of damage, but his mind pushed it aside. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. This knowledge did not paralyze him, it liberated him. He had nothing to save, no future to protect. He was pure retributive energy now. He worked the lever of his Winchester. The brass carrier block rose, ejecting the spent casing which spun through the air, glinting in the sun. He slammed the lever forward, stripping a fresh cartridge from the tube and feeding it into the chamber. The mechanical action was smooth, practiced, ignoring the devastation in his body. He swung the barrel toward the other targets. The smoke was thick, drifting in the light breeze, creating a shifting curtain of visibility. He saw shapes moving through the haze. He saw the muzzle flashes of the Regulators' guns, bright orange blossoms in the gray fog. He fired again. The recoil of the carbine punched against his side, but he rode it, using the momentum to cycle the action again. Crack, clack, another round. Loaded. He was pumping fire back at the house, suppressing the men who were trying to kill him. The sheer volume of fire was intense. The Regulators were shooting wild, their aim spoiled by the smoke and the surprise of Robert's resilience. They had expected him to drop with the first volley. They had expected a quick execution. Instead, they were facing a man who refused to die. The psychological shock of this was palpable. Men ducked behind the adobe walls, peeking out to snap off shots. They yelled to each other, their voices thin and strained over the roar of the gunfire. "He's hit! I saw him hit!" someone screamed. But the man in the yard kept shooting. Robert's mule, spooked by the explosion of noise and the smell of powder, bolted. It tore the reins from where they trailed on the ground and galloped away toward the river, its saddle empty. Roberts was now completely isolated. He had no mount, no cover, and a bullet in his guts. He stood in the open, a stationary target in a killing zone. But the dust kicked up by the mule and the gun smoke created a temporary screen. He used it. He began to back up, moving toward the heavy doorway of the main house, seeking the cover of the thick adobe walls. He moved with a hitch in his step, the pain in his abdomen flaring with every movement, but he kept his rifle up, kept the barrel sweeping the porch. Johnny Middleton, a solid and reliable gunman for the Regulators, stepped out to get a clear shot. He raised his rifle, trying to acquire a sight picture through the haze. Robert saw the movement. He pivoted, his body turning as a unit to compensate for his bad shoulder. He fired from the hip again. The bullet missed Middleton's heart but struck his chest or shoulder area, the impact spinning the large man around. Middleton dropped his rifle and fell back against the wall, shouting in pain. The Regulators were taking casualties. The equation was shifting. It was no longer 13 against 1, it was 13 frantic men against a machine that bled but did not stop. The noise in the yard was a cacophony of war. The crack of the high-velocity rifle rounds, the deeper boom of the heavy revolvers, the thwack of slugs hitting wood and adobe. The window glass of the agency house shattered, raining shards onto the floor inside. Splinters of wood flew from the porch columns. Dust puffed from the walls where bullets impacted. The peaceful agency had been transformed instantly into a chaotic battlefield. Dr. Blazer, hiding inside, pressed himself against the floor, listening to the destruction of his property. Roberts reached the wall of the house. He was breathing hard, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked down at his coat. There was a dark stain spreading across his midsection, the blood soaking through the wool. He felt the wetness, warm and sticky. He knew the location of the wound meant a slow death. The bowel was perforated. There would be no surgeon who could fix it, not here, not now. The certainty of his death clarified his tactical situation. He had minutes, maybe an hour, of functional consciousness left. He intended to use every second. He leaned against the door frame, using the solid wood for support. He cycled the Winchester again. He had fired 3 or 4 rounds. The tube held more. He was still in the fight. He looked out into the yard. The smoke was beginning to clear slightly, drifting toward the river. He saw Boder being dragged back by his comrades. He saw Middleton slumped on the porch. He saw the others scrambling for better cover. He had hurt them. He had drawn blood. The Regulators were rattled. They had ridden in as the predators, expecting a rabbit. They had found a badger. The ferocity of Robert's defense had broken their rhythm. They were no longer firing in a coordinated volley. They were shooting individually, popping up and ducking back. They were afraid. The myth of their invincibility, bolstered by their numbers, was being dismantled by a single dying man. They shouted warnings to each other. "Watch him! He's still up!" Inside the house, Billy the Kid moved toward the window. He was light on his feet, eager to get into the mix. He saw Roberts backing toward the door. He saw the blood. He calculated the angles. He didn't feel fear so much as a heightened sense of reality. This was the game. This was the stakes. He checked his pistol, his eyes bright. He wanted a shot. Roberts, now braced against the doorway, scanned the targets. His vision was tunneling, the edges of his sight going dark from the shock of the wound, but the center was clear. He focused on the shapes of the men. He fired again, the bullet chipping the adobe near George Coe's head, forcing the farmer to dive for the dirt. Roberts was suppressing the entire squad. He was holding the doorway, turning it into a fortress. The pain was evolving. It was no longer just a punch. It was a fire in his belly, a burning, tearing sensation that radiated up his spine. He gritted his teeth, biting down on a groan. He would not give them the satisfaction of hearing him cry out. He would only give them the sound of his rifle. He checked the ammunition status in his mind. He had rounds in the gun. He had a box in his pocket. He was fine. The dust in the yard settled on the blood that had dripped from Boder. The bright red spots turned brown in the dirt. The smell of the powder lingered, mixing with the smell of fear. The first volley was over. The initial explosion of violence had passed, leaving behind a new reality. Roberts was mortally wounded. Boder was down. Middleton was hit. The element of surprise was gone. Now it was a siege. The sun continued to shine, oblivious. The river continued to run. But for the men at Blazer's Mill, the world had narrowed down to the distance between the muzzle of a Winchester and the flesh of a man. The sheer brute force of the encounter was undeniable. There was no finesse here, no dueling etiquette. It was a brawl with heavy-caliber weapons at point-blank range. It was ugly, messy, and loud. Roberts shifted his feet, finding a stable platform on the wooden threshold. He was making his stand here. He would not retreat further. This doorway was his Alamo. He watched the corners of the buildings, waiting for the next movement. He saw the barrel of a rifle poke out from behind a wagon. He fired instantly, his bullet striking the wheel spokes, sending splinters flying. The rifle withdrew. He was still faster. He was still dangerous. The Regulators realized they could not just rush him. To charge the door would be suicide. Roberts was too good, even gut shot. They had to think. They had to maneuver. Dick Brewer, from his position of cover, began to issue orders. He wanted them to spread out, to get angles, to flank the doorway. He was trying to regain control of the tactical situation. He did not know that he was issuing orders for a fight that would claim his own life. The minutes dragged on. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was a heavy, loaded silence punctuated by the groans of the wounded and the metallic click of reloading weapons. Roberts used the pause to take stock of his body. His legs felt heavy. His hands were shaking slightly, but he locked his muscles, forcing them to obey. He was running on pure will. He looked at the empty yard where his mule had been. He looked at the mountains in the distance. He would never cross them again. He accepted this. He turned his attention back to the sights of his carbine. He waited for the next head to pop up. He was the specter of death in the doorway, bleeding out but refusing to fall. The first volley had decided his fate, but he was determined to decide theirs. The shock of the event rippled through the witnesses. The workers at the mill, hiding behind logs, watched in disbelief. They had seen gunfights before, but nothing like this. This was not a drunken dispute, it was a war. The volume of fire, the discipline of the shooter, the immediate casualties. It was a level of violence that belonged on a battlefield, not a trading post. As the smoke finally cleared completely, the tableau was revealed. Robert stood in the dark rectangle of the door, a silhouette of defiance. The Regulators were scattered behind barrels, walls, and wood piles, pinned down by the threat of his rifle. The ground between them was a no-man's land of dust and potential death. The first volley had failed to end the fight. It had only started the dying. Roberts coughed, a wet, hacking sound that brought the taste of copper to his mouth. He spat on the floorboards. He adjusted his hat. He was ready for round two. He knew they were coming. He knew they wouldn't stop until he was dead. But he had a few more bullets, and he intended to use them all. The Sawmill fight had transitioned from an attempted arrest to a desperate last stand. The grit of the situation was absolute. There was no glory, only blood, dust, and the mechanics of killing. The first volley had been the opening chord of a dirge that would play out for the rest of the afternoon. The heavy wooden doorframe of Dr. Blazer's agency house became the defining geographic coordinate of Andrew Roberts' existence. Having retreated from the open yard under a hail of gunfire, the wounded man now wedged himself into the darkened aperture, transforming the rectangular opening into a defensive strongpoint. The adobe walls of the structure were thick, built to withstand the extremes of the high desert climate and the potential threats of the frontier, measuring nearly 2 feet in depth. This architectural density provided Roberts with a deep embrasure, a physical shield that covered the majority of his body while allowing him to traverse the barrel of his Winchester across the sunlit killing ground outside. He was no longer a target in the open. He was a fortified position, a singular battery of violence entrenched within the main building of the settlement. Roberts slumped against the interior jamb, his boots sliding on the floorboards, which were now slick with his own blood. The abdominal wound he had sustained from Charlie Beaudre's initial shot was a catastrophic disruption of his biology. The heavy slug had perforated the lower bowel, creating a channel of trauma that was actively draining his life force. The pain was not a sensation he could ignore. It was a dominant, screaming reality that eclipsed all other sensory inputs. It felt as though a red-hot iron bar had been driven through his pelvis. Yet the shock and the primal survival instinct flooded his system with adrenaline, granting him a temporary, unnatural stamina. He pressed his left hand against the wound, feeling the warm, wet pulse of the hemorrhage, then wiped his palm on his trousers to regain a friction grip on the fore end of his carbine. Outside, the Regulators were scrambling to adjust to this new tactical paradigm. They had expected a quick execution in the yard, a simple overwhelming of a lone gunman. Instead, they faced a siege. The smoke from the first exchange still drifted lazily in the air, thinning but not gone, hanging like a shroud over the space between the house and the sawmill. The men who had been caught in the open during the initial volley had dived for cover behind wagons, lumber stacks, and the corners of the outbuildings. They were shouting to one another, their voices ragged with the stress of the sudden combat. They called out names, checking for casualties, their confidence shaken by the ferocity of the dying man's resistance. Billy the Kid, possessing a constitution that seemed immune to the paralyzing effects of fear, was the first to attempt to break the stalemate. He was positioned near the side of the house, close enough to hear the labored breathing of Roberts inside the doorway. The Kid, armed with a pistol and a lightweight agility, calculated that the older man must be slow, crippled by the gut shot and the bad shoulder. He decided to rush the position, to overwhelm. Roberts with speed before the veteran could cycle the action of his rifle. It was a gamble based on the arrogance of youth and the assumption of the enemy's incapacity. The kid broke from his cover, sprinting across the short distance of the porch, his boots hammering the wood. He moved with a blurred intensity, intending to stick his revolver around the door frame and fire blindly into the room. But Roberts was not slow. His body was failing, but his reflexes were honed by decades of survival. He heard the rush of footsteps. He anticipated the vector of the attack. As the kid's silhouette darkened the edge of the doorway, Roberts did not hesitate. He thrust the muzzle of the Winchester forward, firing from the hip in a snap reaction. The carbine roared within the confined space of the room, the muzzle blast a physical concussion that shook dust from the ceiling rafters. The bullet, a .44 caliber slug moving at over 1,000 feet per second, missed the center mass of the kid's chest by inches. It tore through the fabric of his coat and grazed his arm, the friction of the passing projectile burning the skin like a branding iron. The shockwave and the noise slammed into the kid, checking his momentum instantly. He spun away, the debris from the doorframe stinging his face, and scrambled back off the porch, diving behind a rain barrel. He checked himself frantically, finding the furrow of the graze but no deep hole. The realization that he had come within a hair's breadth of death sobered him. He yelled to the others that the old man was still fast, that the doorway was a meat grinder. Roberts worked the lever of his rifle again. Clack, clack. The brass casing chimed as it hit the floor. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps, trying to minimize the movement of his abdominal muscles. He scanned the yard through the rectangle of light. He saw the barrel of a rifle protruding from behind the corner of the sawmill. He fired immediately, the bullet smashing into the wood, sending splinters flying and forcing the shooter to retract. He was suppressing the entire squad. By controlling the doorway, he controlled the angles. Anyone who wanted to get a clear shot at him had to expose themselves to his return fire. And his return fire was terrifyingly accurate. Dr. Blazer, cowering in a back room of the house, listened to the systematic destruction of his home. The agency, usually a place of government business and quiet trade, sounded like the front line of a war. Every shot fired by Roberts reverberated through the adobe structure, a booming testament to the man's refusal to die quietly. Blazer worried for the safety of the non-combatants, the family members and workers who were hiding in the various buildings. He realized that as long as Roberts held the door, the regulators would pour fire into the house. The walls were thick, but the windows and doors were vulnerable. The siege settled into a rhythm of potshots and suppression. The regulators, realizing that a frontal assault was suicide, began to move around the perimeter, looking for blind spots. They fired from the cover of the corrals, their bullets thudding into the adobe around the door, kicking up clouds of dust that drifted into Roberts' face. He blinked the grit away, his eyes watering but open. He did not waste ammunition. He waited for a target. He knew he had a limited supply of cartridges in his pockets and in the magazine. Every round had to serve a purpose. George Coe, positioned behind the adobe wall of a nearby shed or the corner of the house itself, felt the frustration mounting. He was a man of the soil, a cousin to Frank who had tried to negotiate, and he felt a personal stake in ending this violent disruption. He was armed with a revolver and a rifle, and he considered himself a capable marksman. He saw that Roberts was focused on the sawmill side of the yard. Coe believed he could lean out, take a quick sight picture, and put a bullet into the darkness of the doorway before Roberts could traverse his weapon. It was a sniper's duel at close range, played out with iron sights and black powder. Coe shifted his weight, preparing to break cover. He cocked the hammer of his weapon. He took a breath and held it to steady his aim. He leaned out from the corner, exposing his head and his right shoulder, bringing his gun up to align the sights. He looked into the doorway. He saw the dark shape of Roberts, But he also saw the muzzle of the Winchester. Roberts had not been looking at the sawmill. He had been baiting the look. He had sensed the movement at the periphery of his vision. The timing of the event was instantaneous. Coe's eye found the target, but Roberts' finger was already on the trigger. The Winchester barked again. The bullet flew across the yard, cutting through the intervening air with lethal precision. It struck George Coe's right hand, which was positioned near his face as he aimed. The projectile hit the trigger finger, the digit essential for the operation of a firearm. The impact was grotesque and absolute. The bullet obliterated the finger, shattering the bone and tearing the flesh away in a spray of red mist. The round continued, striking the weapon itself, damaging the mechanism and rendering it useless. Coe screamed, a high-pitched sound of shock and agony that cut through the noise of the gunfight. He dropped the ruined gun and fell back behind the wall, clutching his maimed hand to his chest. He looked at the injury in horror. Where his trigger finger had been, there was now only a ragged stump of bloody tissue and white bone splinters. The pain hit him a second later, a nausea-inducing wave that buckled his knees. He had been disarmed in the most permanent way possible. The realization that he had lost a part of himself, a part defined by his ability to work and fight, was a psychological blow as heavy as the physical one. Inside the doorway, Roberts grimaced. He had aimed for the head or the chest, but the hand had been in the way. It was a hit nonetheless. Another gunman neutralized. He cycled the action. Clack, clack. The rhythm was slowing down. His arms were feeling heavy, the muscles trembling with fatigue and blood loss. The floor around him was becoming a slick pool. The smell of copper and excrement from his abdominal wound was filling the small space, a pungent reminder of the clock ticking down on his life. The wounding of George Coe sent a ripple of hesitation through the remaining regulators. They had seen Boder gut shot, Middleton chest shot, the kid grazed, and now Coe maimed. 4 of their number had been struck by a single man who was supposedly dying. The arithmetic of the fight was horrifying. They were winning the war of attrition only because Roberts was bleeding to death, not because they were outfighting him. The doorway had become a mouth that chewed up anyone foolish enough to approach it. Dick Brewer, watching from a safe distance behind the lumber stacks, assessed the situation with a growing desperation. He was the leader. He had brought these men here. He had served the warrants, and now his force was being dismantled. He needed to end this. He yelled orders to the men to keep their heads down, to stop exposing themselves. He realized that small arms fire from the yard was ineffective against the fortress of the doorway. Roberts was too deep in the shadows, too well protected by the adobe. To kill him, they would need a better angle, a shot that bypassed the walls. Roberts used the lull in the shooting to shift his position. His legs were beginning to cramp. He tried to stand straighter, but the pain in his gut doubled him over. He ended up kneeling on one knee, propped against the door jamb. It was a stable firing position, but it meant he could not move quickly if they rushed him again. He checked the loading gate of his carbine. He shoved 2 more cartridges in, topping off the magazine. He patted his coat pocket, feeling the weight of the remaining box of ammunition. He had enough to kill them all if they gave him the targets. The sun had moved in the sky, changing the lighting in the yard. The shadow of the house was stretching out, offering a little more concealment to the regulators near the porch. But the doorway remained a black void to them. They could not see Roberts clearly. They could only see the muzzle flash and the puff of smoke that signaled another round coming their way. To Roberts, looking out, the yard was still bright, the targets backlit or illuminated by the afternoon glare. He had the visual advantage. He coughed again, the spasm racking his body. He spat blood. He knew the internal bleeding was filling his abdominal cavity. He felt cold despite the exertion. The shock was setting in deeper. He focused his mind on the simple mechanics of the task. See a target, align the sights, squeeze the trigger, cycle the lever. It was a loop, a program, running in his brain that kept the darkness at bay. The psychological impact on the Regulators was profound. They were men who lived by the reputation of their violence. They were the enforcers of the Tunstall faction, and yet they were being held at bay by a crippled, solitary figure. The invincibility of the mob had been shattered. They looked at each other with wide eyes, seeing the fear reflected in their comrades' faces. They were no longer hunting. They were surviving. Frank Coe, who had tried to make peace, was tending to his cousin George. He wrapped a bandana around the mangled hand, pulling it tight to staunch the flow of blood. George was pale, his teeth chattering. Frank looked toward the house, his expression hardening. He had liked Roberts. He had respected him. But now, with his family's blood on the ground lead caused by the bullet, the respect was turning into a cold desire for the end. But he also knew that rushing that door again was a death sentence. The standoff continued. The agency grounds, usually filled with the sounds of sawing wood and shoeing horses, were now silent except for the occasional crack of a rifle and the groans of the wounded. The birds had long since fled the area. The wind whistled through the eaves of the house, a mournful sound that accompanied the waiting. Roberts remained in his fortress, a dying king on a throne of blood-stained floorboards, guarding the entrance to his own tomb. He watched a tumbleweed roll across the yard, catching on the wheel of a wagon. It was a mundane detail, but his mind latched onto it. It was real. It was there. It proved he was still alive. He shifted his grip on the Winchester. The wood of the stock was slick with sweat and blood. He wiped it on his sleeve. He was ready. He was waiting. The doorway fortress was secure, held by the sheer force of will of a man who had decided that if he was going to die, he would not die alone. The Regulators held a council of war in whispers, behind the wood piles. They needed a new plan. They couldn't starve him out. He was already dying. They couldn't rush him. He was too accurate. They needed a single decisive shot. Brewer looked at the wood stacks, then at the house. He began to see a geometry that might work. He began to move, leaving the safety of the main group, circling wide to find a position that would negate the cover of the doorway. Roberts did not see Brewer move. He was focused on the sector in front of him. But he sensed a shift in the energy of the siege. The firing had stopped. The shouting had stopped. It was the quiet that worried him. The quiet meant they were thinking, and thinking men were dangerous. He pressed his shoulder against the doorframe, seeking the solidity of the earth and straw bricks. He was part of the house now. He was the lethal spirit of the architecture. The minutes ticked by, marked by the dripping of blood and the beating of his heart. Andrew Roberts, the man from the Ruidoso, held the line. He had turned a simple threshold into the most dangerous square footage in the territory of New Mexico. The Battle of Blazer's Mill had ground to a halt at his feet, stopped cold by the barrel of his gun. But the stillness was deceptive. It was merely the intake of breath before the final scream. The stalemate at Blazer's Mill had devolved into a contest of nerves and geometry. While Andrew Roberts held the doorway of the agency house, bleeding onto the floorboards, Dick Brewer, the leader of the Regulators, grew increasingly intolerant of the situation. The sun had shifted its position in the sky, altering the shadows that draped across the dusty yard, but the tactical reality remained unchanged. A single dying man was effectively suppressing a squad of 13 heavily armed deputies. To Brewer, this was not just a tactical failure. It was a personal affront to his command and a dangerous delay that jeopardized the safety of his men. Every minute they spent pinned down was a minute the U.S. Army or a sheriff's posse could be riding toward the sound of the gunfire. He realized that the frontal angles were useless. To kill the man in the dark rectangle of the door, he needed elevation or a flank. He needed a line of fire that bypassed the thick adobe walls that Roberts was using as a shield. Brewer signaled to his men to maintain their suppressing fire, though the rate of return had slowed significantly as ammunition supplies were checked and courage wavered. He pulled back from his cover behind the wagons, moving with a low, crouching gait to avoid drawing attention from the doorway. He circled wide, moving away from the main cluster of regulators near the house and heading toward the sawmill structure itself. The mill was a chaotic assembly of machinery and raw materials. Huge stacks of timber cured and ready for processing lay arranged in the yard. Mounds of sawdust, yellow and fragrant, formed soft hills that absorbed the sound of his boots. The large circular saw, currently silent, stood as a testament to the industry that had been interrupted by the violence. Brewer's destination was a specific pile of logs located approximately 140 paces from the agency house. From this vantage point, the angle into the doorway was oblique, potentially exposing the interior of the room where Roberts crouched. It was a long shot for a pistol, but Brewer was armed with a rifle, a weapon capable of lethal accuracy at that distance. He moved methodically, keeping the bulk of the lumber stacks between himself and the house until he reached his chosen position. The physical exertion of the movement caused sweat to run down his back, soaking his shirt under his heavy coat. The air was filled with the smell of pine resin and the lingering sulfur of the earlier volleys. He reached the log pile and knelt behind it. The logs were large ponderosa pines stripped of their bark, rough and solid. They offered excellent cover, a wall of wood that would stop any pistol bullet and most rifle rounds. Brewer rested his Winchester on the top log, settling the barrel into a groove in the wood to stabilize his aim. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim lower to shield his eyes from the glare. He peered over the sights, looking across the yard toward the agency house. The distance was significant, but the target was clear. From this new angle, the darkness of the doorway was not just a flat void. He could see the depth of the jam, and if he looked closely, he could distinguish the vague, dark shape of Roberts huddled against the frame. Inside the house, Roberts was fighting a battle on two fronts, the external threat of the regulators and the internal collapse of his own body. The pain in his abdomen had transitioned from a sharp agony to a dull, overwhelming sickness that radiated through his entire torso. He felt a cold numbness spreading in his extremities as his blood pressure dropped. He knew the end was coming. He could feel the life draining out of him with every beat of his heart, but his mind remained lucid, focused on the singularity of the gunfight. He had stopped firing to conserve ammunition, listening instead to the sounds of the yard. He heard the shift in the enemy's disposition. He heard the cessation of the close-range fire. He knew they were moving. Robert scanned the perimeter with eyes that were beginning to lose their ability to focus on the periphery. He squinted against the bright light of the afternoon. He saw the wagons, the corrals, the outbuildings. Nothing moved. Then his gaze drifted to the sawmill. The stacks of lumber created a complex landscape of horizontal lines and shadows. He watched them intently. He knew that if he were out there, that is where he would go. It was the best sniper's nest on the field. He rested his cheek against the stock of his carbine, though he could not shoulder it properly due to his old injury. He held the weapon tight against his ribs, the barrel pointing toward the mill. Brewer, behind the log pile, took his time. He wanted the first shot to be the last shot. He breathed slowly, trying to lower his heart rate. He aligned the front sight of his rifle with the shadowed figure in the door. He accounted for the drop of the bullet over the distance. He accounted for the wind, which was negligible. He saw Roberts shift slightly, perhaps adjusting his leg. It was the movement Brewer needed to confirm the target. He tightened his finger on the trigger. The metal was cool against his skin. He felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He was about to end the standoff. The report of Brewer's rifle cracked through the valley, distinct and sharp. The bullet spanned the 140 yards in a fraction of a second. It slammed into the heavy wood of the doorframe, inches from Robert's head. The impact sent a shower of splinters and adobe dust into the dying man's face, blinding him momentarily and stinging his skin. The sound of the strike was a loud, percussive thwack. Roberts flinched, instinctively pulling back deeper into the room. He wiped the dust from his eyes with his sleeve, his heart hammering against his ribs. It had been a close shave, too close. The smoke from Brewer's rifle puffed out from behind the log pile, a white cloud that hung in the still air for a second before dissipating. That puff of smoke was the error. In the era of black powder, a shooter revealed his position the moment he fired. Roberts saw the white plume. He saw the exact location of the sniper. He did not need to see the man. He only needed to know where the bullet had come from. Roberts did not hesitate. He did not take time to clean the dust from his eyes or check his wounds. He reacted with the instinct of a predator who has been snapped at. He leveled his Winchester toward the log pile. The distance was extreme for a snapshot, especially for a man shooting from the hip with a devastating gut wound. A 140-yard shot required precise elevation and a steady hand. Roberts had neither. He had pain and he had grit. He trusted the weapon. He trusted the muscle memory that had kept him alive through the Civil War and the frontier conflicts. He squeezed the trigger. The heavy carbine bucked against his side, the recoil sending a fresh wave of agony through his perforated intestines. The muzzle flash illuminated the dark room for a split second. The bullet, a .44 caliber chunk of lead, exited the barrel and began its flight across the yard. It flew over the dust, over the discarded debris of the fight, toward the stack of pine logs. Dick Brewer was cycling the action of his rifle, preparing for a follow-up shot. He had seen the splinters fly. He knew he had been close. He raised his head slightly to reacquire the sight picture, peering over the top of the log. He did not see the bullet coming. It arrived with the finality of a thunderbolt. The projectile struck Brewer in the left eye. The physics of the impact were gruesome. The bullet, traveling at high velocity, smashed through the ocular orbit, obliterating the eye and entering the brain case. It traversed the skull, destroying the neural pathways instantly, and exited the back of his head, taking a portion of the skull with it. Brewer did not scream. He did not gasp. The lights simply went out. His body, suddenly bereft of the electrical impulses that commanded it, went limp. He collapsed forward onto the logs, his rifle clattering against the wood, and then slid down behind the pile, crumpling into the sawdust. The violence of his death was absolute and instantaneous. One moment he was the commander of the Regulators, a man of authority and anger. The next, he was a corpse cooling in the shade of the timber. The silence that followed the shot was heavier than before. The other Regulators scattered around the yard waited for Brewer to fire again. They waited for his command. They heard nothing. They saw no movement behind the log pile. "Dick?" someone called out, their voice tentative. There was no answer. The only sound was the wind rushing through the gaps in the lumber stacks. Frank Coe, watching from a position near the mill, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had seen the puff of smoke from Robert's gun. He had seen the lack of reaction from Brewer. He knew. He crawled forward, keeping low, moving toward the log pile. He called Brewer's name again, louder this time. Still nothing. He reached the position and peered over the logs. He saw Brewer lying in the yellow sawdust, the blood pooling dark and thick around his head. The sight was a hammer blow to the morale of the group. Their leader was gone. The man who had held the warrant, the man who had driven them this far, had been erased by a single bullet from a dying man. Inside the house, Roberts slumped back against the wall. The effort of the shot had drained the last reserves of his energy. He coughed, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth again. He did not know for certain that he had killed the sniper, but the silence told him he had at least stopped him. He cycled the action of his Winchester one more time, ensuring a fresh round was in the chamber. It was a reflex, a defiance of the inevitable. Clack, clack. The sound was weaker now, his arm trembling with the effort. The death of Dick Brewer shifted the entire psychological landscape of the battle. The Regulators were no longer a posse, they were a group of terrified young men who had lost their rudder. The invincibility they had felt that morning riding in with the sun on their backs was gone. They were facing a monster, a man who could not be killed and who punished every attempt to harm him with lethal precision. The log pile, which was supposed to be the position of advantage, had become a death trap. The other men began to realize what had happened. Word passed down the line in hushed, fearful whispers. Dick is dead. He got Dick. The panic began to set in. They looked at the doorway of the house with a new level of superstitious awe. It wasn't just a fortified position, it was a cursed place. Roberts was not just a gunman, he was a revenant fighting with the strength of the grave. Roberts closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the rushing of the blood in his ears. It sounded like the river outside. He wondered how much time he had left. The shadows were getting longer. The afternoon was waning. He had held them off. He had made them pay. He thought of the check in his pocket, the paper that was supposed to be his ticket out. It was stained with his blood now. Useless. The irony did not make him smile. He was past smiling. He was past everything except the waiting. The sun beat down on the body of Dick Brewer. The flies, attracted by the scent of blood, began to gather. The sawdust absorbed the fluids, turning a dark, rusty color. The log pile stood silent, a monument to a failed tactic. The duel was over. It had lasted only seconds, but the result was permanent. The range, the angle, the difficulty of the shot, all of it defied the odds. But in the chaos of Blazer's Mill, the odds had ceased to matter. Only the hits counted. Roberts opened his eyes. He stared at the patch of sunlight on the floor. It was moving inch by inch toward the wall. He used it as a clock. When the light hit the wall, maybe it would be over. He gripped the rifle. He was still the king of the doorway. He was still the most dangerous thing in the valley. The remaining Regulators huddled in their cover, leaderless and shaken. They looked to each other for direction but found only fear. Billy the Kid, usually the first to act, stayed behind his rain barrel, his face pale. He had been grazed. Brewer was dead. The cost of this arrest was becoming too high. The equation of 13 against 1 had been balanced by death. The sawmill loomed over the scene, its machinery quiet, its potential for violence unfulfilled by the saw but realized by the gun. The logs, meant for building homes and fences, had served as a barricade for a killing. The smell of the pine was now inextricably linked with the smell of death. Roberts waited. He did not taunt them. He did not yell. He simply existed in the doorway, a lethal fact that they could not remove. The log pile duel had proved that distance was no safety. It had proved that cover was no guarantee. It had proved that as long as Andrew Roberts drew breath, no Regulator was safe. The wind picked up, swirling the dust in the yard. It rattled the loose boards of the mill. It tugged at the coat of the dead man behind the logs. The valley seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if the violence would continue or if the death of the captain had broken the will of the squad. Roberts didn't care. He had one job left, to die hard. And he was doing it well. The report of Andrew Roberts' rifle, the shot that had killed Dick Brewer, ceased to echo off the canyon walls, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more oppressive than the gunfire itself. In the yard of Blazer's Mill, the sudden absence of noise was physically disorienting. The 13 men who had arrived that morning as a unified, deputized force were now fragmented, their command structure decapitated by a single .44 caliber slug. Behind the log pile, the body of Dick Brewer lay motionless in the sawdust, a visual confirmation of the disaster that had befallen the Regulators. The remaining men, scattered behind wagons, rain barrels, and corners of adobe buildings, stared at the position where their leader had fallen. They waited for movement, for a groan, for an order. There was nothing. The realization settled over them like a cold shroud. The man who carried the warrant, the man who provided the legal and moral compass for their crusade, was gone. The psychological impact of Brewer's death was immediate and devastating. The Regulators were a collection of young, volatile men held together by the force of Brewer's personality and the shared grievance over Tunstall's murder. With the anchor removed, the group began to drift into panic. They looked toward the agency house, specifically at the dark rectangle of the doorway where Roberts remained entrenched. The fear they felt was not just of the man, but of the seemingly supernatural resilience he displayed. He had been shot through the gut, a wound that should have incapacitated him hours ago, yet he had systematically dismantled their attack, wounded 3 of their best gunmen, and killed their captain. To the superstitious minds of the frontier, Roberts had become something more than human. He was a revenant, a force of vengeance that could not be stopped by mere bullets. Frank McNabb, now arguably the senior man by experience if not by title, assessed the tactical situation. It was a catastrophe. They had lost the element of surprise. They had lost the superior ground. They had taken 50% casualties in terms of combat effectiveness, if one counted the demoralization. To continue the siege was to invite more death for no gain. Roberts was already dying. The blood trail in the house and the nature of the wound confirmed that. Killing him now would serve no purpose other than spite, and the cost of that spite was proving to be exorbitantly high. McNabb signaled to the others, a frantic waving of hands and low whistles indicating a withdrawal. The process of extraction was fraught with danger. To get to their horses, the men had to cross lines of sight that Roberts controlled. They moved with a skittish, jerky energy, their confidence completely evaporated. Billy the Kid, nursing the graze on his arm, moved with a pragmatic urgency. He abandoned any thought of heroics. He holstered his pistol and crouched low, running toward the hitching rail where the horses were tied. The animals were still agitated, smelling the blood and the powder, their eyes wide and rolling. The kid reached his mount, his fingers fumbling with the knot in the leather reins. He kept his head down, expecting at any second to hear the crack of the Winchester from the doorway. George Coe, his right hand a ruin of bloody meat and shattered bone, required assistance. He was in shock, his face the color of old parchment, his breathing shallow and rapid. Frank Coe moved to his cousin's side, keeping the bulk of the main house between them and the doorway. He grabbed George by the good arm, hauling him upright. George stumbled, his knees weak, a low moan escaping his lips. Frank hissed at him to be quiet, to move. They navigated the perimeter of the yard, using the lumber stacks as a screen. The pain in George's hand was a blinding white noise that drowned out everything else, but the fear of the rifle drove him forward. They reached their horses. Frank had to lift George into the saddle, the wounded man crying out as the movement jarred his injury. Frank tied George's boots to the stirrups with a piece of rope, a grim precaution to keep him from falling off if he passed out on the trail. Charlie Boder, suffering from the severe gunshot wound to his side where the bullet had deflected off his belt buckle, moved with a pronounced limp. He held his hand pressed against his ribs, his face grimacing with every step. He was no longer the cheerful, whistling gunman who had ridden in that morning. He was a battered survivor. He mounted his horse with difficulty, groaning as he swung his leg over the cantle. He grabbed the horn of the saddle with both hands, hunching over, trying to protect his injured side. John Middleton, hit in the chest, was in a similar state. He was pale and shaky, his breath coming in wheezing gasps. He needed help to mount, 2 of the uninjured men hoisting him up. He slumped forward, over the neck of his horse, his fingers tangling in the mane. The squad that was preparing to leave looked nothing like the cavalry unit that had arrived. They were a hospital train on hooves, a defeated remnant retreating from a disaster. Inside the doorway, Andrew Roberts watched them through a haze of pain. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the duel with Brewer was beginning to ebb, replaced by the crushing reality of his internal trauma. He saw the movement at the hitching rail. He saw them mounting up. He rested the barrel of his Winchester against the doorframe. He had rounds left in the magazine. He could have fired. He could have dropped one or two more of them as they scrambled. But he did not pull the trigger. The will to kill had been replaced by a profound exhaustion. He had done enough. He had defended his life, or at least the last few hours of it. He had taken their captain. The point had been proven. He watched them with eyes that were glazing over his, breath rattling in his throat. The Regulators did not wait for a formal order to depart. As soon as they were in the saddles, they turned their horses toward the road leading away from the mill, back toward the Hondo. They did not ride in formation. They rode as a disorganized mob, kicking their mounts into a gallop, desperate to put distance between themselves and the sawmill. The sound of hooves pounding the dirt was chaotic, a thunder of retreat that kicked up a massive cloud of dust. They rode low over the necks of their horses, looking back over their shoulders, waiting for a parting shot that never came. They left behind the body of Dick Brewer. In their haste and fear, they abandoned their leader where he had fallen, a final indignity that underscored the depth of their panic. The preservation of their own lives outweighed the code of brotherhood. As the dust cloud from the retreating posse drifted down the valley, the silence returned to Blazer's mill. It was the silence of the aftermath, distinct from the peace of the morning. It was a silence filled with the smell of copper blood, burnt sulfur, and fear. The agency grounds were deserted of combatants, save for the one man in the doorway and the one man behind the logs. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves of the cottonwoods, sounding like a whisper across a graveyard. Dr. Blazer waited a full 5 minutes after the sound of the hooves had faded before he dared to open the door of his office. He stepped out onto the porch, his face pale, his eyes scanning the yard. He saw the destruction. The bullet holes in the adobe, the shattered glass, the splinters of wood littering the ground. He looked toward the doorway of the main house. He saw Robert slumped there, the rifle still clutched in his hands, his chin resting on his chest. Blazer moved cautiously toward him, stepping over the debris. He called out Robert's name softly. Roberts lifted his head slowly. The movement was agonizing, his eyes focused on Blazer with difficulty. He did not speak. He simply looked at the agent with a gaze that communicated the entirety of his suffering. Blazer approached him, seeing the blood that had pooled around his legs. The doctor in him. Blazer was a dentist but possessed practical medical knowledge, recognized the pallor of death. He saw the location of the entry wound on the abdomen. He knew there was nothing to be done. Other figures began to emerge from the hiding places around the mill. The workers, the clerks, the Apaches who had been waiting for their rations. They came out into the sunlight, blinking, looking at the scene with a mixture of awe and horror. They gathered in small groups, whispering, pointing at the doorway and the log pile. They were the witnesses to history, the people who would tell the story of the one man who fought the 13. Blazer signaled to two of the stronger workers. They approached Roberts gently. The dying man did not resist as they took the Winchester from his hands. The weapon was heavy, the barrel still warm to the touch. They lifted him carefully, trying to keep his body straight to minimize the pain. Roberts groaned, a low guttural sound that was stripped of all pride. They carried him out of the blood-slicked doorway and into the main room of the agency house. They laid him on a mattress that had been dragged onto the floor. Blazer knelt beside him, cutting away the blood-soaked clothes to inspect the wound. It was a clean entry, but the internal damage was massive. The bullet had traversed the intestines and lodged near the spine. Peritonitis was inevitable. Infection was already beginning. Blazer cleaned the wound with water and whiskey, a futile gesture of comfort. He bandaged it tightly, not to stop the bleeding but to hold the man together. Roberts lay staring at the ceiling, his breathing shallow. He asked for water. Blazer held a cup to his lips. He drank greedily, the water spilling down his beard. Outside, another group of men walked to the log pile. They found Dick Brewer. He lay face down in the sawdust, his arms splayed out. They turned him over. The single bullet wound in his eye was stark and clean. The back of his head was gone. They covered his face with his hat. There was no need for a doctor here. They lifted the body, carrying it toward the carpenter's shed. The sawdust clung to his clothes, a yellow shroud for the man who had come to enforce the law. The sun began to dip toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the valley floor once more. The light turned a deep, bruised purple. The temperature dropped. The adrenaline that had fueled the events of the day dissipated, leaving behind a cold reality. The Battle of Blazer's Mill was over. The score was settled in blood. The Regulators had fled, broken and bleeding. Roberts had stayed, broken and dying. In the quiet of the room, Roberts spoke. His voice was a whisper, a rasp of air over vocal cords. He asked about the men he had shot. Blazer told him that they had ridden off, that they were hurt but alive, except for Brewer. Roberts nodded slightly. A grim satisfaction settled on his features. He had done what he said he would do. He had not been taken. He had made them pay for the warrant. The retreat of the 13 was a ride of shame and pain. Miles away, the Regulators slowed their horses to a walk. They were exhausted. The wounded men were swaying in their saddles, fighting to stay conscious. George Coe's hand was a throbbing mass of agony. Boder was pale and silent. They stopped at a creek to wash their wounds and drink. They looked at each other and they saw the change in their own eyes. They were no longer the invincible boys of the morning. They were men who had looked into the face of death and blinked. They had left their captain behind. The guilt of that abandonment would weigh on them as heavily as the fear. Back at the mill, the evening settled in. The workers began to clean up the yard. They shoveled fresh dirt over the bloodstains. They picked up the spent brass casings, pocketing them as souvenirs. They swept the glass from the porch. They tried to erase the signs of the violence, but the atmosphere of the place had changed permanently. The air felt charged, heavy with the spirits of the dead and the dying. Dr. Blazer sat by Robert's side as the darkness fell. He kept a lamp burning low. He wiped the sweat from the dying man's forehead. Roberts drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, he did not talk of the fight. He talked of the pain. He talked of the cold. The morphine Blazer had administered took the edge off, but it could not stop the inevitable shutdown of his organs. The retreat of the Regulators had left a vacuum in the valley, a space that was now filled by the solitary struggle of Andrew Roberts. The man who had been the target was now the center of the world for the people at the mill. They watched him die with a reverent fascination. He was the man who had turned a sawmill into a killing ground. He was the man who had sent 13 gunmen running. The night deepened. The stars came out, cold and indifferent. The river rushed on, its sound unchanged by the violence of the day. The retreat was complete. The Regulators were gone, licking their wounds in the darkness of the Hondo. The mill was silent. The only battle left was the one inside Robert's body, a battle he could not win with a gun. The day of April 4th, 1878 ended not with a bang, but with the slow, ragged breathing of a man waiting for the end. The mood in the agency house was somber. The men spoke in hushed tones, respecting the presence of death. They looked at the Winchester leaning in the corner. It looked like just a tool now, a piece of wood and iron. But they knew what it had done. They looked at Robert's hands, now still on the blanket. They were small hands, calloused and scarred, hands that had held off an army. As midnight approached, Robert's breathing changed. It became irregular, punctuated by long pauses. The death rattle began, the sound of fluid accumulating in the lungs. Blazer held his hand. He did not pray. He just offered the comfort of presence. He knew that Roberts was walking a lonely trail now, one where no mule could carry him. The retreat of the 13 had been a physical departure, a flight from danger. But Robert's retreat was internal, a withdrawal from the world of the living. He was leaving the pain behind. He was leaving the war behind. He was going to a place where there were no warrants, no lists, and no regulators. The events of the day had been a collision of immovable forces. The stubbornness of the old soldier against the arrogance of the young gunman. The result was a draw written in blood. The 13 had failed to take the 1. The 1 had failed to survive the 13. It was the brutal arithmetic of the West, where the only clear winner was the Undertaker. The sawmill stood in the darkness, a silent monument. The logs that had protected Brewer were now just wood again. The doorway that had protected Roberts was just an entrance. But the memory of what had happened there had been burned into the wood and the adobe. It was a story that would be told around fires for generations. The story of the day the 13 ran away. The story of the day the sawmill became a fortress. Robert stirred one last time before the deep coma set in. The mundane reason for his journey had been swallowed by the violence of the destination. He was part of the soil of Blazer's mill now. The silence of the night was absolute. The retreat was over. The battle was over. Only the dying remained. And as the hours ticked toward dawn, the legacy of the fight began to solidify, turning from news into history, from history into legend. The 13 had come to finish off one dying man, but they had found that the dying man was the hardest thing they had ever tried to kill. And in the end, they were the ones who had to run. April 5th, 1878. The dawn broke over the Sacramento mountains with a cruel, indifferent beauty. The light that spilled into the Tularosa Valley was pale and cold, illuminating the frost that had settled on the wooden shingles of the sawmill and the hard-packed earth of the agency yard. Outside, the agency began to stir, but the usual noise of industry was muted. The workers moved with a respectful quietness, aware of the shadow that hung over the house. The sawmill, which was usually whining with the sound of the blade biting into timber by this hour, remained silent. There was work to be done, but it was not the cutting of lumber for fences or homes. It was the carpentry of the grave. 2 men, employees of the agency, were dispatched to the carpenter's shed to construct the final vessels for the combatants. They selected rough pine planks, wood that had been milled on the very machine that Roberts had defended. The wood was yellow and fresh, smelling of resin, a scent that cut through the stale air of the aftermath. They measured the planks by eye and by rule. They needed 2 boxes, one for Dick Brewer, whose body lay cold and stiff in the shed, and one for Andrew Roberts. The sound of the hammer striking nails began to echo across the yard. Thud, thud, thud. It was a rhythmic, utilitarian sound, devoid of ceremony. The men worked efficiently, driving the iron nails into the soft pine. They did not plane the wood smooth or varnish it. These were field coffins, functional containers designed for immediate use. The sawdust from their work piled up on the floor, mixing with the dust of the previous day's battle. The preparation of the body was a grim task. Blazer and an assistant stripped the blood-soaked clothes from the corpse. As they removed the layers of wool and cotton, the physical history of the man was revealed. They saw the fresh, devastating wound in the groin and abdomen, the hole dark and ugly. But they also saw the old scars. They saw the disfigured right shoulder, the joint ruined by the load of buckshot years prior. The skin was puckered and white, the bone beneath it misshapen. It was the physical evidence of the handicap Roberts had overcome to fight his final battle. It was a map of violence written on the skin. They washed the body with water from the Tularosa River, cleaning away the dried blood, the sweat, and the filth of the siege. They dressed him in a clean shirt and trousers, items donated from the agency stores. While Roberts was being prepared, other men went to retrieve Dick Brewer. The Regulator captain had been lying in the shed since the previous afternoon. Rigor mortis had set in, freezing his limbs in the position of his death. They had to use force to straighten his arms to fit him into the coffin. The single bullet wound in his eye was stark, a black tunnel into the skull. They cleaned his face as best they could, washing away the dried blood and the sawdust that had clung to him. They did not have a clean suit for him, so he was buried in the clothes he had died in, his duster still coated in the dust of the ride. The two coffins were brought out into the yard. They were simple, rectangular boxes of yellow pine. They were placed side by side on the ground near the sawmill. The visual juxtaposition was powerful. Here lay the two antagonists of the battle, the hunter and the hunted, now reduced to identical wooden crates. The animosity, the warrants, the political divide, all of it had been rendered null by the great equalizer of death. They were just two heavy boxes waiting for the earth. The digging of the grave was the next phase of the labor. A spot was chosen on a rise overlooking the mill, a piece of ground where the earth was deep enough to accept the dead. The soil was hard, a mix of clay and rock that resisted the spade. The grave diggers took turns, sweating in the afternoon sun, swinging the picks and shovels. The sound of metal striking stone rang out, a sharp counterpoint to the rushing of the river. They dug a single large trench. It was a pragmatic decision. Digging two separate graves in the rocky soil would have taken twice as long. In the economy of the frontier, effort was a resource to be conserved, so the decision was made that the enemies would share a grave. As the hole deepened, the pile of fresh earth grew beside it. The soil was dark and rich, contrasting with the dry, dusty surface. It smelled of damp roots and ancient stone. The men worked in silence, stopping only to wipe their brows or take a drink of water. They were not burying heroes or villains, they were burying the day's work. The sheer physicality of the task grounded the event. It stripped away the myth and left only the weight of the dirt. By late afternoon, the grave was ready. It was 6 feet deep, rectangular, and dark. The coffins were carried up the slope. It took 4 men to carry each box. The weight of the dead was heavy, a dead weight that pulled at the shoulders of the bearers. They lowered Brewer's coffin first, using ropes to ease it down to the bottom. It settled with a dull thump. Then they lowered Robert's coffin. It was placed directly beside Brewer's. The two boxes touched, wood against wood. In the tight confines of the grave, the two men who had killed each other were now locked in an eternal proximity. Dr. Blazer stood at the head of the grave. There was no preacher present. The rites of the church were a luxury that Blazer's mill could not provide on this day. Blazer spoke a few words, a secular eulogy that acknowledged the tragedy of the waste. He spoke of the violence that had consumed the territory and the hope that this burial might mark an end to it, though he knew in his heart it would not. The workers and the few remaining witnesses stood with their hats in their hands, heads bowed. The wind ruffled their hair and tugged at their coats. Then came the sound of the earth returning. The first shovelfuls of dirt hit the wooden lids with a hollow, drumming sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of finality, The dirt covered the yellow pine, hiding the boxes from the light. The men shoveled faster, wanting to finish the job. The trench filled up, the mound of earth slowly rising until it was level with the surrounding ground, and then higher, forming a fresh scar on the landscape. They packed the dirt down with the backs of their shovels. They placed large stones over the mound to prevent the coyotes from digging. A resting place defined by the industry of the mill and the violence of the men who had come there. The sawdust from the coffins, the shavings from the mill, the dust of the fight. It was all mixed into the soil. After the burial, the men walked back down to the agency. The sun was setting, casting the long shadows that signaled the end of another day. The yard was empty now. The bloodstains on the porch had been scrubbed and covered with fresh dirt. The shattered glass had been swept away. The bullet holes in the adobe remained, pockmarks that would scar the building for years, silent testimony to the volume of fire that had been exchanged. But the bodies were gone. The physical presence of the conflict had been moved underground. The legacy of the fight began to solidify almost immediately. The riders who had fled the Regulators were already spreading the story in the Hondo Valley and beyond. They told of the man who wouldn't die. They told of the Buckshot Roberts who fought like a demon. They tried to justify their retreat, to explain how 13 men had been routed by one. In their telling, Roberts became 10 feet tall, a supernatural force. The reality that he was a crippled, gut-shot man who simply refused to quit was far more terrifying and gritty than the legends they spun. The Battle of Blazer's Mill became a pivot point in the Lincoln County War. It stripped the conflict of any lingering pretense of lawful arrests. The death of Dick Brewer removed the moderate influence from the Regulators, paving the way for the more reckless leadership of men like McNabb and the rising infamy of Billy the Kid. The sheer brutality of the encounter, the fight-to-the-death nature of it, hardened the hearts of everyone involved. There would be no more attempts at arrest. Future encounters would be shoot on sight. In the days that followed, the silence at the mill returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a haunted place. The workers went back to their tasks. The saw blade whined again, cutting timber for the settlements. The water rushed through the flume, but the eyes of the men often drifted to the doorway of the agency house, visualizing the dark figure standing there. They drifted to the log pile where Brewer had fallen. They drifted to the fresh mound of earth on the hill. The physical details of the fight remained etched in the environment. The splinters on the doorframe, the dark stains on the floorboards that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. The smell of the place seemed to hold a metallic tang for weeks. Travelers passing through would stop and ask to see the spot. They would walk the ground, stepping where Roberts stepped, trying to understand the geometry of the survival. They would look at the distance from the log pile to the door, 140 paces, and shake their heads in disbelief at the shot. Roberts' mule, which had bolted during the fight, was eventually found grazing miles down the river. It was brought back to the agency, a riderless animal that served as a living reminder of the man who had ridden it in. It was sold or absorbed into the agency's stock, its history as the mount of the dead man becoming just a footnote in the ledger. The grave on the hill settled. The rain came and packed the earth tighter. Grass began to grow on the mound, reclaiming the scar. But beneath the surface, the two skeletons lay in their pine boxes, slowly returning to the elements. The lead slug in Brewer's skull and the lead slug in Robert's spine remained imperishable artifacts of the day they met. Dr. Blazer wrote his report to the Department of the Interior. He detailed the incident in dry, bureaucratic language. A fight occurred at the agency. 2 men killed. Agency property damaged. The report was filed away in Washington, a piece of paper drowning in a sea of bureaucracy. But the true record was not on paper. It was in the minds of the men who were there. It was in the fear that lingered in the eyes of the Regulators. It was in the legend of the grit that defined the Old West. The story of the 13 against the 1 became a touchstone for the hardness of the era. It was not a story of glory. There were no heroes at Blazer's Mill. There were only survivors and the dead. It was a story of pure, distilled violence and the refusal to submit. It was a story about how a man with nothing left to lose becomes the most dangerous thing on earth. As the sun set on April 5, 1878, the Tularosa Valley fell into darkness. The wind blew down from the mountains cold and steady. It whispered through the pines and over the fresh grave. The sawdust grave held its occupants tight. The finish of the dying man was complete. He had turned the sawmill into a killing ground, and then he had turned it into his final resting place. The narrative of his life ended there under the dirt and the stones, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any gunshot. The sheer brute force of the event had burned itself out, leaving only the cold ash of history.